Welcome, everyone. As the night settles in, let's drift together into the pages of time, unfolding another story from the past. Maybe you're already lying in bed, or simply letting history keep you company before sleep. Where are you listening from tonight? I'd love to know the place and hour of yours as these words reach you. And if these gentle tales of lives long ago bring you comfort and rest, I'd be honored to have you stay with me by subscribing to this channel. So, here's the story. Yuki Onna, a tale of frost and longing. The breath of the mountain. The world was a study in monochrome, a canvas of unending white beneath a sky the color of bruised slate. The wind did not whisper, it screamed, a keening lament that tore through the dense stands of bamboo and ancient cedar, bending them into supplicant arcs. Each gust carried 1,000,000,000 frozen daggers, stinging any exposed surface and piling the snow into deep, treacherous drifts. This was the heart of the Hida Mountains in the dead of winter, a place where nature's raw, unforgiving power was absolute. To the few villages clinging to the lower slopes, the peak of Mount Tsurugi was a forbidden realm, a sacred and terrible place belonging to the kami and the yokai, the spirits. It was a land where travelers vanished, their bodies discovered only in the thaw, frozen solid with expressions of profound terror etched upon their faces. On this particular evening, as the light bled from the day, a lone figure fought his way through the deepening snow. His name was Rio, a young woodcutter from a village a day's journey behind him. His oiled paper cloak was stiff with ice, and his straw boots, while thick, were soaked through. His breath plumed before him, a fleeting, warm ghost immediately snatched away by the greedy cold. He was a strong man, with shoulders broad from felling trees and hands calloused from hard labor, but against the mountain's fury, his strength felt insignificant. Desperation was his only fuel. His wife, Hanako, was heavy with their first child, and a difficult winter had left them with little. He had ventured further than any sane man would, seeking the rare, straight-grained cedar that would fetch a high price, a calculated risk that was now tipping towards catastrophe. The storm had descended with shocking speed, transforming a familiar path into an alien labyrinth. Landmarks were swallowed by the whiteout. The world had shrunk to the few feet directly in front of him, a swirling vortex of gray and white. His fingers, numb within their thin gloves, could barely feel the haft of the axe strapped to his back. Fear, a cold serpent distinct from the atmospheric chill, began to coil in his gut. He knew the stories. He had heard the elders speak in hushed, respectful tones around the hearth about the Yuki Onna, the snow woman, a spirit of breathtaking beauty, with skin pale like fresh-fallen snow and hair long and black like a starless midnight. She would appear to lost travelers, her ethereal kimono blending with the blizzard, and with a single icy breath she would steal the life from their lungs, leaving them as frozen statues in her glacial garden. Ryo shook his head, trying to dispel the superstition. "Foolish stories for children," he muttered to himself, the words torn from his lips by the wind. But the fear remained, a primal instinct that resonated with the ancient hostile energy of the mountain. He pushed on, his legs burning with fatigue, each step a monumental effort as he sank to his knees in the powdery snow. The cold was no longer just a sensation, it was a physical presence, a weight pressing in on him, seeping through his layers, seeking the warm, beating core of his life. Just as his hope began to flicker and die, he spotted a darker patch in the relentless white. A small cave, little more than a hollow in the rock face, its entrance partially obscured by a snow-laden pine. It was shelter, it was a chance. With a final, guttural cry of effort, he forced his way towards it, collapsing just inside the mouth of the cave. The relative silence was deafening. The wind's scream was muted here, reduced to a low, mournful hum. He was out of the direct assault, but the cold within the stone chamber was deep and penetrating, a stored chill that had settled over centuries. He tried to light a fire, his hands trembling violently. The flint and steel sparked, but the tinder was damp, and the feeble sparks died before they could catch. Again and again he tried, until the frustration and despair overwhelmed him. A sob caught in his throat. He thought of Hanako, of her warm smile, of the child she carried. He saw their small, dark house, the glow of the irari hearth fire, the smell of cooking rice. The memory was so vivid, so warm, it was a physical pain in his chest. He curled into a ball, pulling his cloak tight, knowing that sleep in this cold was a surrender to death. The warmth was leaching from his body, drop by precious drop, and the great, heavy blanket of unconsciousness began to pull over him. It was then that the air in the cave changed. The temperature, already frigid, dropped further, becoming so sharp it felt like a physical cut. A new light, a soft, phosphorescent glow, began to emanate from the cave entrance, illuminating the interior with an eerie, blue-white radiance. Ryo's eyes, heavy with impending doom, fluttered open, and he saw her. She stood there, silhouetted against the swirling snow outside. She was the most beautiful and terrifying thing he had ever witnessed. Her skin possessed a translucent alabaster quality, seeming to glow from within. Her long, flowing hair was the color of a raven's wing, a stark, beautiful contradiction against the white. She wore a thin, silk kimono of the purest white, adorned with patterns of frost crystals that shimmered in the unearthly light. It should have been insufficient against the cold, but she stood with an unbothered grace, as if the storm itself were her mantle. Her eyes were the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard, a pale, piercing blue that held no warmth, no pity, no humanity. They were ancient eyes, windows to a soul made of frost and silence. Ryo tried to speak, to beg, to pray, but his jaw was locked, his vocal cords frozen. He could only stare, mesmerized by her lethal beauty. She glided towards him, her feet not seeming to touch the frozen ground. She moved with a silence more profound than the quiet of the cave, a whisper of motion. She knelt beside his shivering form, her expression serene and utterly alien. Her scent filled his nostrils, the clean, sharp fragrance of frozen pine needles and distant, untouched snow. She leaned close, her face inches from his. Her lips, the color of a pale winter rose, parted. "The storm is my companion," she whispered, her voice the sound of cracking ice on a still pond, beautiful and brittle. "You are an intruder in my realm." A tear froze on Ryo's cheek. He closed his eyes, waiting for the end, whispering Hanako's name in the sanctum of his mind. The Yuki Onna paused, her head tilted, a minute, bird-like gesture. The name, the thought, the sheer, desperate love emanating from this dying mortal. It was a sensation she had not encountered in a long, long time. It was a flicker of warmth in her world of endless cold. It was curious. She exhaled. But it was not the killing breath, the gust that would flash freeze his heart. Instead, it was a sigh, a plume of mist that settled over him, not with the bite of death, but with a strange, numbing comfort. The cold retreated from his core, just enough to keep the flame of his life from being extinguished. "You cherish life," she whispered, her cold breath brushing his ear. "You have something to return to. This is rare." She drew back, her glacial eyes studying him. A rule, an ancient, unbreakable law of her existence, warred with this newfound curiosity. "Listen to me, mortal," her voice commanded, brooking no argument. "I spare you this night. You will not die by my breath. But know this, you must never speak of this encounter. Not to your wife, not to your village elders, not to any living soul. If you utter a single word of what you have seen, your life and the life of your family will be forfeit. I will know, and I will come for you." Ryo, still paralyzed, managed a tiny, jerky nod. The message was seared into his mind with the cold of her presence. With one last, inscrutable look, the Yuki Onna rose. She turned and drifted back towards the cave entrance, her form dissolving into the swirling snow until she was gone, becoming one with the storm from which she came. The eerie light faded, and the cave was plunged back into near darkness. But Ryo was alive. The killing cold had receded. He lay there, trembling, not just from the cold, but from the profound, soul-shaking terror and the inexplicable miracle of his survival. He had looked into the eyes of a legend, and the legend had found him, worthy of a second chance. The weight of his promise, a vow made to a spirit, settled upon him, a burden he would carry for the rest of his days. Outside, the wind continued its mournful song, but now it carried a new, personal meaning. It was the sound of her voice, a constant reminder that his life was no longer entirely his own. The heart of the blizzard. Long before the woodcutter Ryo drew a tremulous breath in that icy cave, the entity known as Yuki Onna was. She was not born in the manner of mortals, with a mother's cry and a midwife's hands. Her genesis was a confluence of elemental fury and human sorrow, a moment frozen in time and given consciousness. To understand her was to understand the mountain itself, its deepest, most silent winters. Centuries ago, in a time when the land was ruled by clans whose names are now dust, a young woman named Tsuyu lived in a village nestled in the foothills of Mount Tsurugi. She was known for her unearthly beauty, her skin pale and flawless, her hair a cascade of night. But it was her voice that was her true gift, a melodic instrument that could soothe crying infants and make the hardest of men lower their eyes in wistful longing. She was in love with a hunter named Kaito, a man whose spirit was as wild and free as the hawks he sometimes tracked. Theirs was a love story sung by the village elders, a tale of perfect harmony. One brutal winter, a sickness swept through the village. It was a coughing, feverish plague that stole the warmth from its victims, leaving them cold and still. Kaito, seeking a rare medicinal root that grew only near the summit, ventured into the mountains. He promised Tsuyu he would return before the next moonrise. Tsuyu waited. The moon rose fat and full, painting the snow silver. Then it waned to a sliver. Kaito did not return. Driven by a love that eclipsed all fear, Tsuyu wrapped herself in a thin white kimono and followed his path. The mountain, which had always been a benevolent provider, now showed its fangs. A blizzard, a sentient, roaring beast descended upon her. She fought her way through drifts that reached her waist, her voice, once used for song, now crying Kaito's name until it was raw. She found him not far from the cave Ryo would one day stumble into. Kaito was curled against a rock, his body already stiff, his handsome face peaceful in death's embrace, a dusting of snow clinging to his eyelashes like diamond tears. Tsuyu's heart did not simply break, it shattered. The grief was a physical cold that invaded her, more penetrating and absolute than the mountain's chill. She threw her head back and let out a final, piercing cry, a a sound of such pure, agonizing loss that the very wind halted its scream for a single, respectful moment. Then she collapsed over her lover's body, her warmth leaching away, her life essence seeping into the snow. But the mountain, an ancient and capricious entity, did not let her go. It drank her profound sorrow, her unwavering love, her final desperate sacrifice. The elemental cold, the blizzard's fury, and the human tragedy fused. From that nexus of pain, Yuki Onna awoke. She opened her eyes, and they were no longer Tsuyu's soft, dark eyes, but the pale, blue orbs of the glacier. Her love, once a warm, beating thing in her chest, was transformed into a permanent, aching void, a vacuum that sought to freeze all it encountered. Her voice, her beautiful voice, was now the sound of the wind's lament. She became the memory of that winter, the embodiment of love frozen in death, a story given form to forever wander the scene of its own tragedy. Her existence from that moment was a solitary vigil. She was the snow, and the snow was her. She felt the unique crunch of each footstep on a fresh powderfall, heard the secret conversations of ice crystals forming on frozen branches, saw the world through the lens of perpetual frost. Her survival was tied to the cold. She drew sustenance from the dropping mercury, grew stronger with each passing blizzard. The warmth of the sun, the budding of plants in the brief summer, these were not joys, but a slow weakening, a fading. She was most alive when the world was most still and most deadly. Her journey was not one of distance, but of observation. She became a silent witness to the cycles of life and death upon her mountain. She saw villages rise and fall. She saw generations of woodcutters and hunters tread paths she knew intimately. She watched lovers steal secret moments in summer meadows, their warmth and passion a distant, irritating echo of a life she had lost. She saw greed. Us men fought over hunting grounds. She saw kindness. Us a stranger shared a meager meal. These human dramas played out like shadow puppet shows on the shoji screen of the seasons, and she was the detached, frozen audience. Her exceptional ability, the icy breath that could stop a heart, was not merely a weapon. It was an extension of her being, the crystallization of her core essence, that moment of ultimate loss. When she exhaled her frost upon a traveler, she was not just killing them. She was sharing her truth, gifting them the profound, still silence that had become her entire world. It was a mercy, in her mind, to spare them the slow, gnawing cold of a lonely death, to transform them instantly into a thing of perfect, beautiful ice, a statue to join her silent, glacial garden. They would never feel the pain of a love lost, the slow decay of a warming heart. Her life was a series of significant moments, each one layering another sheet of ice over the ghost of Tsuyu's memory. The first time she took a life, it was a bandit, a cruel man who had murdered his companion for a sack of rice. She felt no remorse, only a sense of cold justice. The first time she spared a life, it was a child, a little girl who had wandered from her village, her tears freezing on her cheeks. Looking into the girl's wide, innocent eyes, something in Yuki Onna's frozen core had twitched, a phantom pain. She had simply vanished, leaving the child to be found by her frantic father. These encounters were like cracks in her icy facade, hairline fractures that were slow to heal. Her culture was the culture of the lonely, the forgotten, the spirits of the borderlands between the human world and the spirit world. She knew of the Tengu who haunted the higher crags, the Kappa in the streams, the mischievous Zashiki Warashi in the old houses. They were her kind, the yokai, But she kept her distance. Their motivations were too chaotic, their existences too intertwined with the follies of mankind. She was a purist, a spirit of a single, focused purpose, to be the winter. Her legacy in those early centuries was the fear, the stories the villagers told, the warnings mothers gave their children, the offerings of rice and salt left at the tree line to appease her. These were the threads of her tapestry in the human world. She was a cautionary tale, a reason to respect the mountain, a name to be whispered with a mixture of dread and awe. She was the reason a wise man would never venture out during a whiteout, the explanation for a strange cold spot in a summer forest, the face one saw in the swirling snow just before losing consciousness. And so, when she encountered Rio, the woodcutter, it was not a random event. It was another data point in her endless study of humanity. His palpable love for his wife, his desperation to provide, the vivid warmth of his memories, they were a particularly bright and intense flame in the gloom. It had intrigued her, this flicker of selfless devotion in a world so often defined by base survival. Sparing him was an experiment, a violation of her own nature, driven by a curiosity she had not felt in 100 years. She had placed a piece of her story, a fragment of her law, upon his shoulders. He was now, unwittingly, a part of her intricate, frozen narrative. As she dissolved back into the storm, she wondered, with a detachment that was not quite absolute, what would become of this mortal who carried her secret in his warm, beating heart? The thaw and the frost. Ryo's return to the world of the living was a slow, painful birth. The dawn that followed the storm was a muted, gray affair, the sun a pale, diluted coin behind a veil of high cloud. The wind had exhausted its fury, leaving behind a landscape of profound, silent stillness. The snow lay in deep, unblemished drifts, sculpted by the vanished gale into smooth, elegant curves. When he stumbled from the cave, his lens stiff and protesting, the world seemed new-made, cleansed by the tempest and terrifyingly pure. The memory of the previous night was not a dream, it was a brand seared upon his soul. The image of her face, that impossible beauty, those eyes holding the chill of eternity, was more vivid in his mind than the face of his own wife. Every crunch of his boots in the snow seemed to whisper her warning. You must never speak. I will know. I will come for you. The words echoed in the vast quiet, a silent chant that paced his every step. His journey home was a ghost walk. He moved with a mechanical, weary determination, his body operating on a residual instinct for survival. The familiar path down the mountain, now revealed under the flat morning light, felt alien. Every snow-laden pine seemed to watch him. Every glint of sunlight on an icy branch was a flicker of her kimono. He was a man haunted, not by a malevolent spirit, but by the weight of a miracle and a promise that could cost him everything. When he finally saw the smoke rising from the hearths of his village, a sob of relief caught in his throat. It was a sight he had feared he would never see again. The low, thatched roofs were burdened with snow, and the narrow paths between the houses were being slowly dug out by weary-looking villagers. Their world was small, warm, and fragile, a bubble of humanity clinging to the edge of the wilderness he had just escaped. He pushed open the door to his own small home, the scent of wood smoke and simmering broth washing over him like a physical balm. Hanaka was kneeling by the irori, the sunken hearth in the center of the single room. When she saw him, her face, pale with worry, transformed. A cry of pure joy escaped her lips, and she struggled to her feet, rushing to him with a speed that belied her condition. "Ryo, you're alive! The gods be praised!" She threw her arms around his frozen, filthy form, her warmth seeping into his icy clothes. He held her tightly, burying his face in her hair, inhaling her familiar scent of clean cotton and gentle sweat. It was the antithesis of the Yuki Onna's fragrance of ice and solitude. For a long moment, he simply held her, feeling the solid, real truth of her, letting her warmth drive the lingering chill from his bones. "The storm," he mumbled into her shoulder, his voice hoarse. "It was bad. I found a cave." He could not tell her. The words, the incredible story, pressed against his teeth, desperate for release. To unburden himself to his wife, to share this terror and this wonder, was a fundamental human need. But the memory of those pale blue eyes froze the confession in his throat. He, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in his mind's eye, the Yuki Onna's breath frosting Hanako's skin, her life extinguished in a single, beautiful moment because of his weakness. The secret became a stone in his gut, a cold, heavy weight he would have to carry forever. "You are safe. That is all that matters," Hanako whispered, pulling back to look at him, her eyes searching his. "But Ryo, your eyes, you look different, as if you have seen a ghost." He forced a smile, a brittle, unconvincing thing. "I am just tired, my love, so very tired." He spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened sensitivity. The crackle of the fire was too loud, the taste of the porridge was too rich. The simple, homely sounds of the village, children laughing, a dog barking, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer, felt intrusive. He had been to the edge of the world, to a place where such noises did not exist, and he had returned changed. He was an imposter in his own life. That night, lying next to Hanako's sleeping form, listening to her soft, regular breathing, he stared into the darkness. The warmth of the futon, the safety of his home, it all felt like a fragile illusion. The mountain was still there, just beyond the wall, vast and silent. And on that mountain, she was there. He had been marked. He was hers in a way he could never explain. His life was no longer his own. It was alone, granted on the condition of his silence. High on the slopes of Mount Tsurugi, the Yuki Onna felt the echo of his return. She existed in a state of perpetual awareness, her consciousness woven into the fabric of the winter landscape. The return of warmth to the lower valleys was a dull ache, a slow, persistent throbbing that she endured every year. But this year, it was different. A single, tenuous thread of connection, finer than a spider's silk and colder than starlight, now stretched from her core down to the village. It was the bond of the promise. Through it, she could feel the faint, warm pulse of Ryo's life. It was an irritant, a pebble in the seamless snow of her existence, but it was also a fascination. She began to watch him. Not with the passive observation she afforded all humans, but with a focused, specific interest. She would manifest as gust of wind that rattled the shutters of his home, carrying away the scent of his hearth smoke. She would be the pattern of frost that formed on his window in the dead of night, through which she could peer into his world. She saw him holding his wife with a tenderness that was both familiar and agonizingly distant. She saw him place a hand on Hanako's belly, his face alight with a hope so fierce it was almost a physical heat. She saw his silence. She saw the way he would sometimes stop in the middle of a task, his eyes growing distant, looking towards the mountain. She saw the shadow that now lived behind his gaze. He was keeping his word. The weight of her secret was changing him, sculpting him as surely as her winds sculpted the snow. One evening, weeks after his return, she watched from the edge of the forest as Ryo chopped wood behind his house. The sun was setting, painting the snow in hues of orange and violet. His axe rose and fell with a steady, rhythmic thwack. Each impact sent a jolt through the silent air. He worked with a desperate energy, as if he could sweat the memory of her out of his system. Hanako came out, bringing him a cup of water. He stopped, taking it from her, and his hand lingered on hers. He did not speak. He simply looked at her, and the expression on his face was one of such profound, aching love and equally profound sorrow that the Onna, hidden within the deepening shadows of the pines, felt a corresponding ache in her own frozen core. It was the ghost of Tsuyu's feeling, a phantom limb of emotion. This man, this mortal, was living the life she had been denied. He was experiencing the joy that was the flip side of her coin of grief. His warmth was a testament to her cold. His vibrant, complicated love was a vibrant, complicated reminder of all she had lost. A strange impulse stirred within her. It was not the urge to kill, to freeze and preserve. It was something else, something she had not felt in centuries, a desire to understand. To touch that warmth, not to extinguish it, but to comprehend its nature, to remember what it was like. She took a step forward, her foot making no impression on the snow. The last rays of the sun caught the silken threads of her kimono, making her gleam for a moment like a thing of fire rather than ice. Ryo, his woodcutter senses heightened since his ordeal, felt a sudden, inexplicable drop in temperature. He looked up from his wife's face, his eyes scanning the tree line. He saw nothing but the gathering darkness beneath the boughs. Yet he knew. He could feel her gaze upon him, a pressure as tangible as a physical touch. The hair on his arm stood up. He gave a barely perceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement to the unseen watcher, before turning and shepherding his confused wife back inside. His movements hurried, protective. The Onna remained at the forest's edge long after the door had closed. The thread between them, once a mere concept, now felt real. It was taut, thrumming with a strange energy. Her experiment had yielded an unexpected result. In sparing his life, she had not merely preserved a subject for observation. She had entangled her eternal, frozen existence with his fleeting, warm one. The thaw in the valley below was no longer just a seasonal annoyance. It was a metaphor for a subtle, dangerous crack forming in the permafrost of her own being. The weaving of fates. The seasons turned with their ancient, indifferent rhythm. The deep snows of winter reluctantly gave way to the slush and torrents of the spring thaw. The mountain shed its white cloak, revealing the dark, wet stone and the vibrant, aggressive green of new growth. For the Onna, this was a time of retreat and attenuation. Her form grew less distinct, her consciousness diffusing, becoming one with the cold mists that clung to the highest peaks and the deep, shadowed ravines where the sun's touch was brief. She was not gone, but she was dormant, a sleeping potential within the mountain's heart. The weaving of fates. The seasons turned with their ancient, indifferent rhythm. The deep snows of winter reluctantly gave way to the slush and torrents of the spring thaw. The mountain shed its white cloak, revealing the dark, wet stone and the vibrant, aggressive green of new growth. For the Onna, this was a time of retreat and attenuation. Her form grew less distinct, her consciousness diffusing, becoming one with the cold mists that clung to the highest peaks and the deep, shadowed ravines where the sun's touch was brief. She was not gone, but she was dormant, a sleeping potential within the mountain's heart. During this time, her awareness of Ryo became a distant, muted thing, like the memory of a chill on a summer's day. The warm, bustling activity of the village was a dull roar at the edge of her perception, an environment too rich and chaotic for her to focus upon. She existed as the coolness of the well water, the last stubborn patch of snow in a north-facing hollow, the evening dew that settled on the leaves. But the thread remained, and through it, in the deep of a summer night, she felt a sudden, sharp, brilliant spike of emotion, a complex wave of terror, hope, and overwhelming love that was so powerful it pierced her dormancy. It was Ryo. The sensation was so intense, so purely human, it was like a lightning strike in her quiet world. She stirred within her misty form, focusing her will, drawn to the source of this emotional cataclysm. In the village, inside the small warm house, Hanukkah was in labor. The midwife had been summoned, and Ryo waited outside, his face ashen. He paced the packed earth, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists. The sounds from within, Hanukkah's muffled cries, the low, reassuring tones of the midwife, were a torture. Each cry was a hook in his heart. He was a man who faced bears and blizzards with stoic courage, but this, the agony of the woman he loved, rendered him utterly helpless. The Yuki Onna manifested not as a full form, but as a condensation of cold air just outside the paper-thin wall of the birthroom. She became the chill that made the midwife shiver and ask for another blanket. She was an unseen presence, a silent witness to this most fundamental of human dramas. She felt Ryo's fear, a cold, sharp thing that was not unlike her own essence. But intertwined with it was a ferocious, protective love, a warmth so potent it was almost a physical force. And from within the room, she felt Hanukkah's pain, a raw, primal energy, and beneath it, a determined, unwavering strength. It was a maelstrom of feeling, a symphony of life at its most intense and vulnerable. Then, cutting through the tension, came a new sound, a thin, reedy, indignant cry. A wave of relief so profound it was dizzying washed out from Ryo, so strong the Yuki Onna felt it like a warm gust. The midwife slid the door open, her face beaming. "A son, Ryo-san, a healthy son. Your wife is tired, but she is well." Ryo stumbled into the room, falling to his knees beside Hanako. He was weeping, great, unashamed sobs of relief and joy. He took the swaddled bundle from the midwife, his large, calloused hands impossibly gentle. He looked down at the tiny, red, wrinkled face of his son, and the Yuki Onna, watching through the veil of reality, saw his entire being transform. The shadow of the mountain, the memory of her, was momentarily burned away by this new, all-consuming light. In that moment, as Ryo looked upon his child, the Yuki Onna experienced something she had not known for centuries, a reflection. She saw in the microcosm of this single room, the echo of her own lost future. The love between Ryo and Hanako, the miracle of this new life, it was the path she and Kaido had been meant to walk. The pain of that lost future, which had been the bedrock of her existence, suddenly felt less like a foundation and more like a prison. She did not feel envy, not in the human sense. It was a deeper, more existential longing, a recognition of a wholeness that she was forever denied. The cold void within her, which she had always taken for granted as her core, ached with a new, sharper poignancy. She lingered only a moment longer, watching as Ryo placed the baby in Hanako's arms, as their little family curled together in a tableau of perfect, exhausted love. The warmth in the room was stifling to her, but she endured it, studying the scene, committing it to her eternal memory. This was what she protected when she had spared Ryo. This was the fragile, beautiful flame that his life represented. As she dissolved back into the cool night air, she felt the thread between her and Ryo change. It was no longer just a tether of a promise. It was now woven with the threads of his fatherhood, his joy, his expanded love. Her intricate, solitary story had become irrevocably entangled with the continuing saga of his life. She had set out to observe and experiment, but she was becoming a part of its results. The silent, deadly spirit of the snow found herself the guardian of a secret that was, itself, the very essence of life's warmth. The naming and the unspoken. The village celebrated the birth of Ryo's son with a quiet, profound joy that mirrored the burgeoning life of the valley itself. Cherry blossoms, delicate as a breath, unfurled their pink and white petals. The air, once sharp with the scent of ice, grew soft and carried the fragrance of damp earth and new growth. In the small house, the world had shrunk to the rhythm of an infant's needs, the hungry cry, the soft sigh of contentment, the small, warm weight in the crook of an arm. Ryo named the boy Haru for the spring in which he was born. The name was a prayer, a hope for a life of gentle seasons and abundant growth, a deliberate turning away from the harshness of the winter that had so nearly claimed his own. When he held his son, the world outside, with its memories and its silent, watching presence, faded into a distant murmur. Haru's tiny fingers would curl around his own calloused thumb, a grip of such innocent trust that it felt like an exorcism. In those moments, the stone of his secret felt lighter, its cold edges smoothed by the overwhelming warmth of this new love. Yet the shadow remained. It lived in the quick, furtive glances he cast towards the mountain, now a lush, green giant against the blue sky. It lived in the way he would sometimes fall silent in the middle of a meal, his eyes losing focus, listening to a silence only he could hear. Hanako noticed. Her woman's intuition, sharpened by motherhood, sensed the part of him that was walled off, a room in their shared life to which she was denied entry. "Ryo," she said one evening, her voice gentle as she nursed Haru by the orori. The fire was low, casting a soft, dancing light. "The mountain, it changed you. You have not been the same since you returned. You carry a weight. Is it only the fear of the storm?" His heart hammered against his ribs. The confession, the need to unburden himself to his wife, to share the terrifying, beautiful truth, rose in his throat like bile. He could almost feel the words forming on his tongue. "I saw her, Hanako, the Yuki Onna. She is real, and she spared me, and her beauty was more terrible than any storm." But then he saw it, a flicker of movement at the window, a crystallization of moisture on the paper pane that formed a pattern like frost ferns, intricate and impossibly cold. It was there for only a second before melting away in the warm room. The warning was as clear as if she had whispered it in his ear. His blood ran cold. He looked at Hanako's concerned face, at the trusting, sleeping form of his son, and the words died unborn. He forced a smile, reaching out to stroke Haru's downy head. "It is nothing, my love. The storm was a reminder of my own mortality. It made me realize how much I have to lose." It was not a lie, but it was a fortress built around a deeper truth. He saw the doubt in her eyes, but she, in her wisdom, did not press him. She simply nodded, accepting the fortress walls, though it pained her to be kept outside. His love for his family became a frantic, protective thing. He worked harder, built a stronger fence, stored away more food. Every action was a bulwark against the unseen, a spell to keep the winter at bay. He was building a summer for Haru, a world where the name Yuki Onna was nothing but a story to be told by the fire, a world where the cold breath of the mountain could never reach. High above, the Yuki Onna watched this domestic drama unfold. The vibrant green of the mountain was an assault on her senses. The cacophony of life, the buzzing of insects, the chattering of monkeys, the riotous growth of plants, was a chaotic noise compared to the clean, silent symphony of winter. She retreated to the highest crags, to places where the air was thin and cold, and pockets of snow persisted even in the height of summer. Here she could think. Here she could remember what she was. The thread connecting her to Ro was a faint, warm hum in the periphery of her being. Through it, she felt the new, powerful frequency of the child's life, a pure, bright energy that was both fascinating and unsettling. She had felt the moment of his birth, that cataclysm of emotion, and it had left a mark on her, like a fossil pressed into stone. She found herself drawn, not to Ro, but to the child. Haru. The name itself was a wave of warmth. One still, moonlit night, when the world was silver and black, she drifted down from her peaks. She moved not as a storm, but as a tendril of mist, silent and unseen, flowing through the sleeping village like a ghost river. She paused outside Ryo's home. The paper shoji screens were open to admit the cool night air. Inside, she could see them. Ryo and Hanako slept on their futon, and between them, in a small wooden crib, lay the infant Haru. The Yuki Onna willed her form to become even less substantial, a mere gathering of cold air and moonlight in the doorway. She gazed at the sleeping child. His chest rose and fell with the tiny, rapid rhythm of new life. His face was a perfect, peaceful blossom in the moonlight. He was the embodiment of everything she had lost: the future, the continuity, the pure, uncomplicated love. A memory, long buried under layers of ice, surfaced in her mind. It was not a visual memory, but a sensory one. The feeling of Kaito's hand, warm and strong, holding hers. The promise of a family, of a home, of a life woven together. The memory was so vivid, so warm, it was a physical pain. The void within her, the frozen core of her being, throbbed with a fresh, acute agony. An impulse, reckless and entirely foreign, seized her. She wanted to touch the child, not to harm him, never that, but to feel that life, that warmth against her coldness, to bridge the impossible gap between her existence and his, if only for a moment. She glided into the room. The temperature dropped slightly. Hanako stirred in her sleep, pulling her blanket tighter. Ryo remained still, locked in his own troubled dreams. The Yuki Onna stood over the crib, a statue of pale moonlight and sorrow. Slowly, hesitantly, she reached out a hand. Her fingers, long and elegant, seemed to be made of solidified mist. They hovered just above the child's cheek. She could feel the radiant heat of his skin, a tiny sun against the void of her touch. Then Haru's eyes fluttered open. He did not cry, he did not startle, he simply looked up at her. His eyes, dark and liquid, held no fear. They were pure, unformed consciousness, simply observing the world. He looked at her pale, beautiful face, at her hair like a spill of midnight, at her eyes the color of winter sky, and he gurgled, a small, happy sound. In that moment, something within the Yuki Onna fractured. The careful, centuries-old architecture of her grief and isolation developed a fissure. The child's unconditional acceptance, his lack of fear, was a key turning in a lock she had forgotten existed. He did not see a monster. He did not see a legend. He simply presence. She did not touch him. She pulled her hand back as if the warmth of his life were a searing flame. The composure she had maintained for centuries threatened to crumble. She, the deadly spirit of the snow, the bringer of the frozen death, was undone by the silent, fearless gaze of an infant. She fled. One moment she was a shimmer in the moonlight over the crib, the next she was gone, dissipating into the night air with a soft, sighing sound, like the last of the winter snow melting away. Back on her mountain, surrounded by the enduring cold, she felt a turmoil she had never known. The memory of the child's face, the feel of his warmth, the sound of his gurgle, it was all a brand upon her soul. The thread connecting her to Ryo was now irrevocably fused with the bright, new thread of Haru's life. Her journey, which for so long had been a solitary path through an eternal winter, had now forked. She had set out to understand the warmth of a mortal's love by observing a father, and in doing so had stumbled upon its purest, most potent source. The silent vow she had extracted from Ryo now bound her not to one man, but to his entire flourishing world. And she, the embodiment of winter's end, had no idea what to do with the fragile, beautiful seed of spring she now carried in her frozen heart. The whispers of the hearth. The years turned, each cycle of seasons etching its passage upon the land and its people. Haru grew from a swaddled infant into a sturdy, bright-eyed boy of 5. His world was the village, the forest's edge, and the comforting, solid presence of his father. Ryo's hair began to show threads of silver at his temples, his face weathered by sun and wind, but the shadow in his eyes never fully left. It was a part of him now, a familiar companion, like the ache in his joints that predicted a coming storm. He was a devoted father, teaching Haru the names of trees, how to identify animal tracks, how to hold a small, blunt-tipped knife to whittle a piece of cedar. But every lesson was tinged with a silent caution. He never took Haru high up the mountain. He would always stop at a certain unmarked boundary, a place where the air grew perceptibly cooler and the light through the canopy took on a different, more somber quality. "Why can't we go further, father?" Haru would ask, his small hand gripping Ryo's larger one. "The mountain is a generous spirit, son," Ryo would reply, his eyes scanning the shadowed slopes ahead. "But its heart is cold and old. It is best to respect its privacy." He wove his warnings into stories. On long winter nights, with the wind howling outside, he would tell Haru the old tales. Of the Tengu who would lead proud men astray. Of the Kappa who would challenge you to a duel of courtesy. And of the Yuki Onna. He was careful. He never mentioned his own encounter. He spoke of her as a legend, a figure from a time long past. He described her beauty, her deadly breath, her loneliness. He made her a part of the landscape, a natural force like the avalanche or the lightning strike, something to be understood and avoided, not a personal specter from his own history. "Does she ever come to the village, father?" Haru asked one evening, his eyes wide in the firelight. Ro's throat tightened. He looked into the flames, seeing for a moment a pair of pale blue eyes. "No, Haru. She belongs to the deep snow, to the high places. She has no business here, where the fires are warm and the hearts are full." He hoped his voice carried more conviction than he felt. For he knew, with a certainty that was bone deep, that she was always there, just beyond the circle of light. He could feel her in the unseasonable chill that sometimes swept through the village on a summer night. He could see her in the intricate frost patterns that decorated the window pane on mornings when no other house bore them. She was a silent curator of his life, and her attention was a constant, low hum in the background of his existence. Hanaka watched these interactions with a quiet sorrow. She saw the way Ryo's stories about the mountain spirits were a language for a fear he could not name. She saw the love in his eyes when he looked at Haru, a love so fierce it was almost desperate. The unspoken thing between them had become a third presence in their marriage, a quiet, cold guest at their table. She had learned to live with its silence, to tend to the warmth of their home around it, like building a fire around a stone that would not heat. For the Yuki Onna, these years were a study in contradiction. The boy, Haru, was a growing beacon of warmth on the thread that connected her to the mortal world. She watched him from a distance, a silent guardian in the mist. She saw him take his first wobbling steps. She heard his laughter, a sound like tiny bells, ringing through the forest. She, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, the curiosity in his eyes, a curiosity that mirrored the one she had felt upon first sparing his father. Her existence, once defined by a single, tragic moment, was now punctuated by the small milestones of his life. The vibrant, chaotic energy of the lower world, which she had always found irritating, now held a strange allure because he was a part of it. She found herself drawn to the edges of the village, not out of morbid curiosity, but with a sense of attendance. She never approached him again as she had when he was an infant. That moment had been too profound, too destabilizing. But she ensured his safety in her own subtle ways. A venomous snake, slithering too close to the path where he played, would find itself encased in a sudden, inexplicable sheath of ice. A sudden, treacherous downpour would part around the small clearing where he was gathering mushrooms, leaving him and his spot dry. She was an unseen hand, gently guiding the chaos of the world away from this one precious life. This guardianship was an anomaly in her nature. It was an active engagement, a bending of her power towards preservation rather than termination. It felt both right and deeply wrong. It was a betrayal of her core essence, the frozen grief that had given her form. Yet, the ghost of Tsuyu, the woman she had been, seemed to stir within the ice, approving of this gentle vigilance. One autumn afternoon, she watched from a stand of fiery maple trees as Rio taught Haru how to use a small fishing rod in a stream that bubbled down from her mountain. The boy was patient, his small face a mask of concentration. Rio stood behind him, his hands guiding Haru's, his voice a low, steady murmur. The scene was one of perfect peace. The sun dappled through the red and gold leaves, the air was crisp with the promise of the coming cold, and the sound of the water was a constant, soothing song. Then, Haru slipped. It was a simple misstep on a mossy stone. His small foot slid, and with a cry of surprise, he tumbled into the deeper, faster-moving current of the stream. Rio's reaction was instantaneous, a roar of panic. He lunged forward. But the Yuki Onna was faster. The world did not slow down. Instead, it focused. Her consciousness, which usually encompassed the entire mountain, narrowed to this single point in the stream. The water around the flailing boy did not freeze solid. That would have trapped him, perhaps harmed him. Instead, the current itself stilled, the molecules of water losing their kinetic energy in a perfect, localized circle around him. The water became thick, syrupy, holding him buoyant and safe, while just inches away, the stream continued to rush and foam. Rio reached his son in 2 great strides, scooping him from the strangely placid patch of water. Haru was coughing, frightened but unharmed. He clung to his father, sobbing. "Hush, my boy, hush," Rio murmured, holding him tight, his own heart hammering against his ribs. He looked down at the water where Haru had fallen. It was already returning to its normal flow, the unnatural stillness vanishing as quickly as it had come. There was no logical explanation. The stream had no reason to be calm in that one specific spot. His eyes, wide with a fear that was more than paternal, scanned the surrounding forest. The maple leaves rustled, though there was no wind. For a fleeting second, he thought he saw a figure, pale and tall, standing between the reddened trunks. A figure that was there one moment and gone the next, leaving behind only a faint crystalline chill in the air and the lingering scent of snow. He held Haru closer, a new and terrifying understanding dawning upon him. The Yuki Onna's interest was not limited to him. His secret, his burden, was no longer his alone. She was watching over his son. The promise he had made in that cave had woven his child into her story. He felt a gratitude so profound it was dizzying, mixed with a terror so absolute it froze the blood in his veins. The spirit of the snow had not just spared his life. She had, in her own inscrutable way, laid claim to his legacy. The weight of a secret. The incident at the stream marked a subtle but irrevocable shift in the delicate equilibrium of Ryo's world. The knowledge that the Yuki Onna's gaze now fell upon his son transformed his quiet vigilance into a constant, low-grade dread. Every shadow in the forest seemed to hold her form. Every gust of wind carried her whispered name. The mountain, once a place of livelihood and challenge, now felt like the walls of a gilded cage, beautiful but inescapable, watched over by a warden whose motives he could not fully comprehend. He became hyper-aware of any anomaly in the natural world. A patch of frost in a sunlit corner of the garden would make his heart stutter. A sudden, localized drop in temperature during a summer evening would send him rushing to find Haru, his eyes scanning the periphery for a glimpse of white. He loved his son with a ferocity that was a physical pain, but that love was now alloyed with the fear of the otherworldly attention he had drawn. Haru, sensing the change in his father, grew more reserved in his questions about the mountain. The stories by the fire became less frequent, their tone more solemn. The boy learned to read the tightness around his father's eyes, the way his shoulders would tense when Haru wandered too far towards the tree line. A boundary, unseen but deeply felt, was being impressed upon his young mind. The world was divided into the safe, warm circle of the village and the mysterious, forbidden realm of the mountain. A realm guarded by a beautiful, cold lady from his father's tales. Hanako watched this dynamic with a heart heavy with helplessness. The silent guest in their marriage had grown, its presence now a palpable chill that seemed to emanate from Ryo himself. She tried to bridge the gap with warmth, filling their home with the smells of baking and the sound of her humming. She would take Haru on long walks through the safe, lower meadows, pointing out flowers and butterflies, trying to build a world for him that was untouched by his father's unnamed fear. But she could not dispel the shadow. It had taken root. One night, after Haru was asleep, she confronted the silence. She knelt before Ryo, who was staring into the dying embers of the Irori, his face a mask of weary sorrow. "Ryo," she said, her voice soft but firm, "this cannot continue. The fear you carry, it is a ghost in this house. It is shaping our son. He feels it, even if he does not understand it. You must tell me what happened on that mountain. What is this weight you have carried all these years?" Ryo closed his eyes. The temptation to confess was an agony. To share this burden, to let his wife bear a part of it, was the deepest desire of his soul. He imagined the relief of speaking the words, of telling her about the cave, the beautiful specter, the icy breath that had promised both life and death. He opened his mouth, the confession poised on his lips. And then the oil lamp in the corner of the room flickered and died. The room was plunged into near darkness, lit only by the faint glow of the embers. A coldness seeped through the walls, a cold that had nothing to do with the night air outside. It was the specific, penetrating cold of deep winter, of high altitudes, of a breath held in anticipation. Hanako gasped, pulling her robe tighter. Where did that draft come from? Ryo said nothing. He simply stared at the dead lamp, his body rigid. The message was clearer than any spoken word. I will know, and I will come for you. The warning was not just for him anymore. It was for her. It was for Haru. His silence was the price of their safety. To speak was to summon the storm directly into their home. He looked at Hanako, his eyes filled with a despair so profound it stole her breath. I cannot, he whispered, the words torn from him. Please, Hanako, do not ask me again. The weight is mine to bear, for all our sakes. He reached out and took her hand. His fingers were ice cold. In that touch, Hanako finally understood the true nature of the shadow. It was not a memory. It was not a simple fear. It was a living, active presence, a covenant her husband had made with something beyond their understanding. The last of her hope for a shared burden crumbled. She now knew that his silence was not a wall between them, but a shield. A terrible, lonely shield. She nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. She did not press him further. She simply held his cold hand between her warm ones, trying to impart some of her own heat, her own strength into him. They stayed like that for a long time, two people bound by love and separated by a secret that was colder than death. The Yuki Onna, having enforced her law, withdrew from the village boundary. The unnatural cold lifted, and the lamp, of its own accord, flickered back to life. She felt no triumph, only a hollow confirmation. The mortal was keeping his word, even at the cost of his own peace, even at the cost of the harmony in his home. His love for his family was the chain that bound him to his promise. She retreated to a high glacier, a river of ancient, compacted ice that groaned and whispered to itself. Here, the world was as it should be, silent, cold, and pure. She tried to lose herself in the familiar embrace of the absolute zero, to become once more the unfeeling spirit of the snow. But the threads would not be silenced. The thread connected to Ryo thrummed with his renewed fear and his heartbreaking resignation. The thread connected to Haru pulsed with the boy's innocent confusion and his burgeoning awareness of a world of hidden dangers. And now, a third thread, finer than the others, had become perceptible, Hanako's. It was a thread of warm, steadfast love, woven with strands of sorrow and a fierce, protective strength. She was entangled, profoundly, irrevocably entangled. Her existence was no longer a solo performance. It was a dissonant quartet with three warm, vibrant melodies playing against her own frozen, mournful note. She looked out over the sleeping world. The villages were tiny clusters of orange light in the vast, dark valley. One of those pinpricks of light was his home. Inside, three hearts beat, their rhythms dictated in part by her will, by her law. A strange restlessness took hold of her. For centuries, her purpose had been clear: to be the winter, to enact the cold justice of the mountain, to be the embodiment of a single, frozen moment of loss. Now, her purpose was muddled. She was a keeper of secrets, a silent guardian, a source of fear in a warm house. She was affecting lives, shaping a family's destiny, not with a single, decisive act of freezing, but with the slow, persistent drip of her presence. The ghost of Tsuyu stirred again, more insistently this time. The memory of a warm hand, the promise of a family, the dream of a home, these were no longer just painful echoes. They were counterpoints to her current existence. The mortal family below was living the life she had been meant to live. And she, in her frozen state, was both their unseen protector and their hidden tormentor. The contradiction was a splinter of warm wood in her heart of ice, causing a slow, persistent inflammation. She had believed her journey to be one of endless, cyclical repetition. Now she sensed it was leading her towards an uncharted territory, a precipice. She did not know what lay beyond it, only that the familiar landscape of her eternal winter was disappearing behind her. The path forward was obscured by a blizzard of her own conflicting impulses, a storm of memory, curiosity, and a longing for a warmth she could never again possess. The boy and the blizzard. 5 more years weathered the village and its people. Haru was 10, no longer a small child, but a boy on the cusp of understanding the world's complexities. He had his father's strong build and his mother's thoughtful eyes. The unspoken rules of his life had become ingrained. The mountain beyond the old cedar tree was not to be explored. His father's occasional, distant stares towards the peaks were not to be questioned. The stories of the Yuki Onna were now told with a reverence that bordered on fear, a sacred caution rather than a thrilling folklore. Yet curiosity, the most persistent of human traits, burned within him. The forbidden mountain, with its dark forests and mist-shrouded peaks, called to him. It was a siren song of mystery, made all the more potent by the secret he sensed was hidden within its folds, a secret that held his father's heart in a frozen grip. The opportunity came on a day in late autumn. The sky was a hard, metallic gray, and the air had the sharp, electric taste of impending snow. Ryo had been called to a neighboring village to help repair a roof damaged in a windstorm. He had left with a stern warning. "Stay close to home, Haru. A great storm is coming. Do not, under any circumstances, go towards the mountain." Haru had nodded, his face a mask of obedience. But as the day wore on and the first flakes began to fall, thick and heavy, the pull became irresistible. This was not the gentle snow of winter tales. This was the mountain showing its power. He would just go to the old cedar, the boundary marker. He would just look. He needed to see the source of the stories, to stand at the edge of the mystery that had haunted his family for his entire life. He told his mother he was going to check the rabbit snares near the edge of the forest. A half-truth, as the snares were in that direction. Hanukkah, busy preserving the last of the autumn vegetables, nodded absently, her mind on her work and the coming storm. "Do not be long, Haru. It feels different today." It did feel different. The wind had a voice, a low, gathering moan that spoke of immense power. The snow did not flutter down. It drove sideways, stinging his face. By the time he reached the great, gnarled cedar, its branches already laden with white, the world had dissolved into a swirling white chaos. The path behind him was erased. The village was gone. He was alone in the heart of the blizzard, exactly where his father had forbidden him to be. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. He turned, trying to retrace his steps, but every direction looked the same. The wind screamed in his ears, a deafening roar that swallowed his cries for help. The cold bit through his padded jacket, seeking his skin. He was disoriented, terrified, and utterly lost. He stumbled forward, his tears freezing on his cheeks, his father's warnings now ringing in his ears with the clarity of prophecy. High on the mountain, the Yuki Onna felt the storm's birth. It was her symphony, conducted by her will, each gust a note, each flake a word. She reveled in the raw power, feeling her own essence magnified, her form becoming more substantial, more real. This was her true state, not the dormant spirit of the summer mists, but the vibrant, deadly goddess of the winter tempest. And then She felt it. A familiar, warm pulse, bright and frantic, moving where it should not be. Haru. The realization struck her with the force of a physical blow. The boy was in the storm. Her storm. The very thing that was her lifeblood was a mortal danger to him. The threads connecting her to the family thrummed with a violent dissonance. Ryo's thread was a cord of pure parental terror, even from a distance. Hanako's was a spike of frantic worry. And Haru's, his, was a bright, flickering flame, guttering in the gale. Without a moment's hesitation, she acted. She did not think. She did not calculate. She simply moved. To Haru, lost and freezing, a figure emerged from the white veil. She was not a sudden apparition. She seemed to coalesce from the swirling snow itself, the storm giving her form. She was exactly as his father's stories had described, impossibly beautiful, with skin like moonlight on snow and hair like a spill of ink. Her white kimono flowed around her, untouched by the wind that tore at him. Her eyes, the color of a frozen lake, held him fast. He should have been terrified. He should have screamed. But a strange calm settled over him. This was the secret. This was the source of the shadow in his father's eyes. And in her gaze, he saw not malice, but a deep, ancient sorrow, and something else, a flicker of recognition. "You are Ryo's son." Her voice was the calm eye of the hurricane, a pocket of silence in the roaring world. It was not a question. Haru could only nod, his teeth chattering. "You are far from home," she said, gliding closer. The air around her was even colder, a deep freeze that made the surrounding blizzard feel almost warm by comparison. Yet the snow seemed to part for her, creating a circle of relative stillness around them. I was curious," Haru stammered. A ghost of a smile, sad and knowing, touched her pale lips. Curiosity is a dangerous guide on this mountain. She knelt before him, her ethereal beauty so close it was dizzying. She reached out, and with a touch as light as a snowflake, she brushed a frozen tear from his cheek. Her fingers were so cold they burned, but the touch was not violent. It was reverent. "Your father carries a heavy vow," she whispered, her voice for his ears alone. "A vow made for love of you before you were even born. My existence is the price of his silence. Do you understand?" Haru, in his 10-year-old wisdom, understood more than most men. He understood the weight in his father's soul. He understood the unspoken guest in his home. He looked into the eyes of the legend and saw not a monster, but a keeper of a promise. He saw the loneliness that was the counterpart to his father's fear. "I understand," he whispered back. The Yuki Onna studied him for a long moment. The boy had his father's courage and his mother's perceptive soul. The bright, warm flame of his life was worth preserving. It was worth more, perhaps, than the strict letter of her ancient law. "This storm is not for you," she said, her tone shifting, becoming decisive. "Close your eyes, child of spring." Haru obeyed. He felt her cold breath on his face, but it was not the killing frost of legend. It was a gentle, numbing mist that settled over him, driving the penetrating cold from his bones, filling him with a strange, peaceful lethargy. When he opened his eyes, the blizzard was gone. He was standing at the edge of the village, just beyond the first house. The snow was falling heavily, but it was a normal, quiet snowfall. The wind was a gentle breeze. He could see the light from his own home, a warm, golden beacon in the gray twilight. He turned to look behind him. The mountain was a shrouded giant, the real storm still raging on its slopes. There was no sign of the beautiful, cold woman. Had it been a dream, a hallucination born of cold and fear? But then he looked down. At his feet, perfectly preserved in the fresh snow, was a single, perfect snowdrop flower, its white petals immune to the cold, a tiny miracle in the deepening winter. It was a message, a confirmation. He picked it up carefully, its delicate form a stark contrast to the rugged world around him. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that his father's secret was now his own. The Yuki Onna was real. She was lonely, and she had saved him. The shadow had a face, and the face was beautiful and sad, and had just shown him a kindness as profound as it was terrifying. He walked towards his home, the snowdrop held gently in his hand, the weight of a new and incredible understanding settling on his young shoulders. The unraveling. The warm, smoky air of the house hit Haru like a physical wall after the pristine, deadly cold of the mountain. He stood just inside the doorway, snow melting from his boots into a small, dark puddle on the packed earth floor. In his hand, he clutched the snowdrop, its delicate white petals a stark, impossible contrast to the grim reality of the storm he had just escaped. Hanaka rushed to him, her face a mask of relief and fear. "Haru, thank the gods! Where have you been? I was so worried." She pulled him into a tight embrace, her hands checking him for injury. "You're freezing. Come to the fire." Her eyes fell upon the flower in his hand. Her breath caught. It was a snowdrop, a flower that should not, could not, be blooming in the heart of a blizzard. Its presence was as unnatural as a sunbeam at midnight. Her gaze lifted to his face, and she saw it there, not the terrified confusion of a lost child, but a deep, unsettling knowing. He had seen something. "Haru?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What happened?" Before he could answer, the door slid open with a violent rush of wind and snow. Ryo stood there, his clothes plastered with white, his face etched with a panic so raw it was terrifying. He had felt it, a father's primal dread, and had fought his way back through the storm. "Haru!" he roared, his eyes sweeping the room and finding his son safe. The relief was instantaneous, but it was immediately supplanted by a deeper, more chilling fear when he saw the expression on his son's face and the flower in his hand. "Father," Haru said, his voice quiet but steady. "I went to the old cedar. The storm came. I was lost." Ryo's blood turned to ice. He took a step forward, his eyes locked on his son's. "And?" The single word was a plea and a command. "She found me," Haru whispered. The world stopped. The crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind outside, it all faded into a dull hum. Ryo felt the foundation of his life, the careful structure of silence and protection he had built over 16 years, crumble into dust. He stared at his son, at the living proof that his secret was no longer his own. "She spoke to me," Haru continued, his young voice filled with a strange, solemn gravity. She said your silence was the price. A vow made for love of me before I was born." Hanako let out a small, choked cry. The pieces, the years of silence, the fear, the unspoken guest, all clicked into a horrifying, magnificent picture. She looked at her husband, her eyes wide with dawning comprehension and a torrent of emotions, pity, terror, and a heartbreaking understanding. Rio, the cave, all these years, it was her. Rio could no longer deny it. The fortress had fallen. He sank to his knees, his broad shoulders slumping in utter defeat. The weight he had carried alone for so long was now a shared burden, and the sharing of it felt like a failure. He had broken his vow, not with his own words, but through the actions of his son. "Yes," he breathed, the word a confession dragged from the depths of his soul. He looked up at his wife and son, his eyes filled with a lifetime of haunted silence. "On the mountain, during the storm, I was dying. She came. She was more beautiful and terrible than anything I could imagine. She spared me. But the price was my silence. I could never speak of her to anyone, or she would return for us all." The story poured out of him then, haltingly at first, then in a rushing torrent. He described the cave, the unearthly light, her icy breath that had promised death and then granted life, the warning that had been his constant companion. He spoke of the years of watching, of feeling her presence, of the constant low-grade terror that had been the soundtrack of his life. As he spoke, the storm outside seemed to intensify, as if in response to the broken covenant. The wind screamed with a new fury, shaking the very walls of the house. The temperature in the room plummeted. The fire in the aurori, which had been burning steadily, guttered and shrank, its flames struggling against an unseen invasive cold. Hanako listened, her hand over her mouth. She did not recoil from her husband. Instead, she went to him, kneeling and wrapping her arms around his shaking form. She understood now. His distance, his fear, his overprotectiveness, it was all an act of love, a desperate attempt to shield them from a power he could not control. Haru stood watching his parents, the snowdrop still clutched in his hand. He had unraveled the mystery, but the truth was far more complex and frightening than any story. He had looked into the Yuki Onna's eyes and seen her sorrow. He had felt her cold, gentle touch. He knew she was not merely a monster from a legend. She was a creature of immense power and profound loneliness, bound to them by a promise his father had made. "She was not angry, father," Haru said softly, breaking the tense silence. "When she found me, she was sad. She told me to close my eyes, and her breath, it warmed me. It led me home." Rio looked at his son, a new kind of fear dawning in his eyes. The Yuki Onna's interest in Haru was now confirmed. She had not harmed him. She had saved him. Why? Was it a further twist of her inscrutable will, a new, more subtle form of torment? Or was it something else entirely? The oil lamp flickered violently and then went out, just as it had years before. The room was plunged into near darkness, lit only by the struggling embers of the fire. A visible frost began to creep across the inside of the windows, forming intricate, frantic patterns, spreading with unnatural speed. The very air crystallized, each breath a cloud of ice. She knew. The broken vow had summoned her. The three of them huddled together in the center of the room, a tiny island of warmth in a sea of encroaching cold. They did not speak. They simply waited, their hearts pounding in unison, staring at the door, knowing that the keeper of the promise was coming to collect her due. The wind's scream died abruptly, leaving a silence more terrifying than any noise. The only sound was the faint, deadly crackle of spreading ice. Then a soft, rhythmic sound began outside the door. Not a footstep, but the gentle crunch of snow under an impossible weight. It stopped just on the other side of the thin paper screen. The story was no longer a secret whispered by the hearth. It was here, at their door, breathing the same frozen air. The unraveling was complete, and the consequences, colder than death, were about to step into the light. Time itself seemed to freeze within the small, dark house. The frantic spread of frost on the windows halted, leaving the panes opaque, sealed behind a shield of intricate ice. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, each inhalation a sharp, crystalline pain in the lungs. The family, Ryo, Hanako, and Haru, clung to one another, a triptych of terror and desperate unity. Their shared warmth was a feeble defiance against the absolute zero gathering on their threshold. The delicate paper of the shoji screen began to change. A patch of moisture bloomed in its center, not from the warmth inside, but from a concentrated cold outside that drew the humidity from the air itself. The moisture crystallized, forming the same complex, fern-like patterns that had decorated the window on the night of Haru's birth, and again when Ryo had nearly confessed to Hanako. It was her signature, her calling card. Then, without a hand touching it, the door slid open. She stood there, framed by the whirling white void of the storm. But the storm behind her was silent, held at bay by her presence. She was more vivid, more real than she had ever been in Ryo's memory or Haru's recent encounter. Her beauty was a devastating force, a clarity so sharp it felt like a blade. Her pale blue eyes swept over the huddled family, and the temperature in the room dropped another 10 degrees. Hanako gasped, her grip tightening on Ryo's arm. This was the source. This was the specter that had haunted her husband and now held her son in its thrall. She was every story, every warning, given breathtaking, terrible form. Ryo found a shred of his courage, the courage that had made him face the mountain alone all those years ago. He moved slightly, putting his body between the Yuki Onna and his family. He met her gaze, his own filled with a lifetime of dread and a final, defiant love. "You have broken your word, mortal." Her voice was not loud, but it filled the space completely, the sound of ancient glaciers calving into a silent sea. It held no anger, it was a simple, cold statement of fact. "The boy spoke," she continued, her eyes shifting to Haru. "The secret is shattered." "I am the one who broke the vow," Ryo said, his voice rough with fear and conviction. "Punish me, take me, but spare them. They are innocent." The Yuki Anna's head tilted, a gesture both alien and curiously bird-like. She glided into the room, her feet making no sound on the frozen floor. The door slid shut behind her, sealing them in this frozen, intimate tableau. She ignored Ryo, her gaze passing over him as if he were a piece of furniture, and focused on Hanako. "You are the wife," she stated, "the warmth he returns to, the reason for his will to live." Her eyes, pools of frozen sky, scanned Hanako's face, taking in her fear, her protective stance, her love for her family. "You have lived with a ghost in your house for many years." Hanako, trembling, found her voice. It was a whisper, but it held steady. Yes. Then the Yuki Anna's attention turned to Haru. The boy did not flinch. He stood his ground, the snowdrop still visible in his clenched fist. He looked back at her, and in his young eyes there was no hatred, no terror, only that deep, unsettling knowing, and a flicker of something that looked like pity. "And you are the child," she said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. "The child of spring. You walked into my storm. You looked into my eyes, and you live." "You saved me," Haru whispered. A long, profound silence followed. The Yuki Onna stood in the center of their home, a creature of myth and ice in the heart of their domestic world. She was examining them, not as a judge preparing a sentence, but as a scholar studying a complex and fascinating text. The rigid law of her existence demanded retribution. A vow was broken. The consequence was death. But the threads were screaming at her. The thread to Ryo was a thick cord of desperate, self-sacrificing love. The thread to Hanukkah was a resilient strand of steadfast devotion and nurturing strength. The thread to Haru was a bright, pure light of innocence and unexpected courage. Together, they formed a pattern she had not encountered in all her centuries. This was not mere survival. This was a tapestry of interconnected love, a warmth that had persisted and even grown because of the cold shadow she had cast. The ghost of Tsuyu stirred within her, not as a memory, but as a rising tide. The warmth of the irori, the simple, homely objects in the room, the palpable love binding these three people together, it was all a mirror held up to her own lost life. To destroy this would not be justice. It would be a desecration. It would be freezing the only beautiful thing she had encountered since her own death. She looked at Ryo, truly looked at him, for the first time since entering. She saw Allahi Wasallam, the man he had become. Weathered, tired, but unbroken. His love for his family, a fire that even her cold could not fully extinguish. "You feared me for 16 years, she said to him, her tone shifting, becoming less accusatory, more conversational. "You built your life around a silence I demanded. You believed my breath was only capable of bringing death." She took a step towards the guttering fire in the irori. She knelt, a movement of impossible grace. The family watched, mesmerized and terrified. She extended a single, pale finger towards the struggling flames. "You are wrong." She did not extinguish the fire. Instead, a delicate, beautiful tendril of frost extended from her fingertip. It did not smother the embers. It danced among them, a spiral of crystalline lace that coiled around the dying heat. The frost did not kill the fire. It shaped it. The flames, as if given a new purpose, began to burn within the icy spiral, their light reflecting off the countless facets, filling the room with a dazzling prismatic glow. The fire was now cradled in ice, its warmth preserved and magnified by the very cold that should have destroyed it. She rose and turned back to them, her expression inscrutable. "The vow is broken," she repeated, "but the reason for the vow remains. Your love for this child, your love for each other." Her gaze encompassed all three of them. "It is a different kind of cold, the cold of solitude. You have shown me a different kind of warmth." She looked directly at Haru. "You asked me no questions. You offered me no fear. You showed me only understanding. That is a rare thing." She moved back towards the door. her form beginning to lose its solidity, blending with the cold air. The debt is paid not in death, but in truth. The secret is free. My hold on you is released. She paused, her form half in, half out of the material world. Her eyes, the last thing to remain distinct, held a sadness so deep and so old, it seemed to contain all the winters of the world. The snowdrop was for you, child of spring, a reminder that beauty can exist in the cold, and that not all that is cold seeks to destroy. And then she was gone. The door remained closed. The terrifying, penetrating cold began to recede, replaced by the normal chill of a winter night. The frost on the windows melted away, revealing the darkness outside. The fire in the orrery blazed normally once more. The beautiful, impossible cage of ice vanished without a trace. The family stood in stunned silence. The threat was gone. The vow was nullified. The shadow had lifted. Rio felt the weight of 16 years evaporate from his soul. He looked at his wife, at his son, and for the first time he saw them without the filter of his fear. He began to weep, great, heaving sobs of relief and liberation. Hanukkah held him, her own tears flowing freely. The ghost was gone. The guest had left. Haru looked down at the snowdrop in his hand. It was no longer just a flower. It was a message, a gift, a key. The Yuki Onna was not just a spirit of death. She was a creature of immense complexity and sorrow. And she had, in her own way, given them their freedom. The story was not over. It had simply changed. The legend had stepped into their home, and in doing so, had transformed from a tale of fear into a story of something far more mysterious and profound. The lingering chill of freedom. The dawn that broke over the village was one of preternatural clarity. The storm had exhausted itself, leaving the world blanketed in a deep, unblemished white that reflected the sharp, pale blue of the sky. The air was still and bitingly cold, but it was a natural cold, the clean chill of a winter morning, devoid of the sentient, predatory frost that had invaded their home hours before. Inside the house, the three of them sat around the orrery, wrapped in blankets, sipping hot tea. The normalcy of the ritual felt strange, almost sacrilegious. The world had ended and begun again in the space of a single night, and yet here they were, performing the simple, daily act of warming themselves. The silence between them was no longer fraught with hidden dread, but was a spacious, shared quiet, filled with the immensity of what had transpired. Rio was the first to speak, his voice rough from disuse and spent emotion. "It is over." He said the words not as a question, but as a statement he was testing on his tongue, feeling its shape and weight. She released us. Hanukkah reached out and laid her hand over his. Her touch was warm, solid, real. "She did," she affirmed softly. "The shadow is gone." But was it? Haru, staring into his cup, felt the weight of the snowdrop, now carefully placed in a small dish of water on the windowsill. Its presence was a paradox. It was a symbol of their freedom, a gift from their former captor, and yet it was also a tether. The Yuki Onna was no longer their warden, but she was not gone. The thread, he felt, had not been severed. It had been transformed. It was no longer a chain, but a filament of connection, thin and cold, stretching from their warm home back up into the silent white peaks. "The stories," Haru said, looking up at his parents, "they never said she could be kind." Rio sighed, a long, weary exhalation that seemed to carry 16 years of tension out of his body. The stories are told by those who fear, son. Fear simplifies things. It makes monsters out of sorrow and justice out of vengeance. He looked towards the mountain, visible now through the clear window. I feared her for so long, I forgot to wonder why she was. Hanako nodded. She was a woman once. She must have loved. She must have lost. The ice, it is her grief, given form. A new understanding was dawning in the warm room. The Yuki Onna was not a force of nature to be appeased or avoided. She was a tragedy, a life interrupted, a love frozen in time. Their family, with its vibrant, complicated warmth, had been a living reminder of everything she had been denied. Her interest in them, her sparing of Rio, her protection of Haru. It was not a game or a whim. It was the actions of a lonely spirit drawn to the light of the life she could never have again. Rio stood and walked to the window, looking out at the majestic, snow-clad peak of Mount Tsurugi. The fear was gone, but in its place was a profound, humbling pity. He had carried the burden of her secret, but she carried the burden of an eternity. His sentence had lasted 16 years. Hers was without end. "We are free of her promise," he said, his back to them, "but I do not think we are free of her story." On the mountain, the Yuki Onna felt the shift in the threads. The taut, fearful tension that had connected her to the woodcutter's family had slackened, replaced by a softer, more complex resonance. There was relief, yes, and a newfound peace. But there was also something else, a dawning comprehension, a fragile empathy. She stood on a wind-swept ridge, the morning sun glinting off the ice crystals that adorned her hair and kimono. The world below was waking up, tiny plumes of smoke rising from the village hearths. One of those plumes was from their home. The act of the previous night had been a violation of her own foundational law. A vow had been broken. The prescribed consequence was death. Yet she had stayed her hand. She had not simply spared them, she had released them. Why? The answer was as complex as the crystalline structure of a snowflake. It was the boy's fearless gaze. It was the wife's steadfast strength. It was the woodcutter's enduring, silent love. It was the sight of the three of them together, a perfect, warm unit that reflected the life she and Kaito should have lived. In that moment, enforcing her law would have felt like shattering a beautiful, ancient vase just to prove it was brittle. The destruction would have been absolute, but the act would have been empty, meaningless. It would have added to the cold void within her, not filled it. So, she had done something new. She had used her frost not to destroy, but to cradle. She had shown them that her essence was not purely destructive. It could be a preserver, a shaper, a frame for warmth. The ice-cradled fire was a metaphor, a truth she had not even fully understood herself until she had created it. The ghost of Tsuyu was quiet now, not stirring, but simply present. The frantic, pained energy of the lost woman had been soothed. For the first time in centuries, the Yuki Onna felt a semblance of alignment between her elemental nature and the echo of the human soul trapped within it. Her journey was no longer a circular path through an eternal winter. It had veered onto a new trajectory. She was no longer just the snow woman, the bringer of the frozen death. She was something more, something for which there was no name. A spirit who had chosen connection over isolation, understanding over judgment. She looked down at the village, at the specific point where the woodcutter's family lived. The thread was still there, a fine silver filament in the tapestry of her awareness. But it was no longer a leash, it was a bridge. A subtle change began to manifest on the mountain. In a sheltered gully near the tree line, where the sun's touch was brief, a patch of snow began to melt, not from the heat of the sun, but from a gentle internal warmth that emanated from the ground beneath. It was a tiny, almost insignificant event, but it was a reversal of the natural order she enforced. It was a thaw initiated not by the season, but by a shift in her own glacial heart. The legacy of the Yuki Onna, the legend told in the villages, was one of fear. But a new legacy, known only to 3 people and the mountain itself, had just been born. It was a legacy of a second chance, of a mercy granted, of a cold that had learned to respect the warmth. She did not know what this new path would bring. Eternity stretched before her, not as an endless, monotonous sentence, but as a landscape of unknown possibilities. The weight of her grief was still there, a core of perennial ice, but around it a new layer was forming, a layer of quiet acceptance and, perhaps, the first fragile hint of peace. The wind picked up, swirling the snow around her feet. It was time to return to the high places, to the silent glaciers and the screaming peaks. But she did not feel the same pull to absolute solitude. She carried a new awareness with her, the memory of a warm house, a family's love, and a single, perfect snowdrop blooming in the heart of a blizzard. The cold was her home, but it no longer felt entirely like a prison. The echo in the village. The change in Ryo's household was as palpable as the change in the season. The silence that had once been heavy and fraught became comfortable and spacious. Laughter, once tempered by an unseen tension, now rang through the small house with its full, unburdened joy. Ryo's shoulders lost their perpetual stoop. The lines on his face seemed to soften, making him look years younger. He worked with a renewed vigor, his axe biting into wood with a clean, confident rhythm, a man no longer laboring under a death sentence. Hanako sang as she worked, her voice a melody that had been absent for too long. She tended her small garden with a new lightness, the simple act of planting seeds feeling like an act of profound faith in a future she could now envision without a lurking shadow. The unspoken guest was gone, and in its place was a shared, incredible secret that bound the 3 of them closer than ever. They spoke of her openly now, though always in hushed, respectful tones. Not us, the Yuki Onna, a title of fear, but simply us, she, a being of immense power and sorrow. They wondered about her, about the man she had lost, about the centuries of loneliness. Their fear had been transmuted into a somber, distant pity. This newfound peace, however, could not be entirely contained within their 4 walls. The village was a small, interconnected organism, and a shift in one of its parts sent ripples through the whole. It started with the children. Haru, freed from the burden of his father's secret, became more open, more engaged. He played with the other village boys, but his games were different. While they staged mock battles with sticks, he would sometimes be found staring at the mountain or gently examining a patch of frost, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Why do you always look at the mountain, Haru?" one of his friends asked him one day as they gathered kindling at the forest's edge. Haru paused, a handful of twigs in his hand. "I'm not afraid of it anymore," he said simply. "But the Yuki Onna is there," another boy said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "My grandfather says she freezes people solid." Haru looked at his friend, his gaze steady. "Maybe she doesn't want to. Maybe she's just very sad." The other boys fell silent, considering this radical idea. It did not fit the terrifying stories they knew, but it came from Haru, who was known to be brave and truthful. A seed of doubt, a crack in the monolithic legend, was planted. The adults noticed the change in Ryo. The man who had always been slightly distant, his eyes haunted by something unseen, was now present. He joined in village festivals, his laughter genuine. He offered advice freely, his mind no longer clouded by a private terror. When Old Man Sato, the village elder, spoke of the mountain spirits around the communal fire, warning everyone to be respectful during the winter months, Ryo did not tense up or look away as he once had. He simply listened, a faint, knowing sadness in his eyes. "Ryo seems lighter since the last great storm," Sato remarked to Hanako one day at the village well. Hanako smiled, a genuine, easy smile. "The storm reminded him of what is important, Sato-san. Family, home." It was not a lie, but it was not the whole truth. The whole truth was a story too immense, too personal to ever be shared. The most significant ripple was the most subtle. The village's relationship with the mountain itself began to shift. The offerings of rice and salt left at the tree line did not cease. Respect was still paramount, but the fear behind them lessened. It became a gesture of acknowledgement rather than appeasement. The mountain was still a powerful, potentially dangerous place, but it was no longer seen as purely malevolent. It was a place of spirits, yes, but spirits who could be sorrowful as well as angry, lonely as well as vengeful. This change in perception was aided by the mountain's own behavior. The winters that followed were still harsh, as was their nature, but they lacked a certain predatory edge. Blizzards would rage, but they seemed less personal, less intent on hunting lost travelers. There were stories, whispered and half-believed, of hunters who had been lost in whiteouts and found their way home guided by a strange, calm patch in the storm, or of a sudden, localized frost that had driven a bear away from a shepherd's flock. The legend of the Yuki Onna was evolving. The tale of the deadly beauty who froze men solid was still the official version, the one told to frighten children into obedience. But alongside it grew a quieter, more nuanced story. A story of a lonely spirit, a lost love, and a mysterious, conditional mercy. It was a story that spoke to the complexity of the world, to the idea that nothing, not even a demon of snow and ice, was entirely as it seemed. Ryo, Hanako, and Haru became the unwitting curators of this new narrative. They never spoke of their direct experience, but the peace they had earned, the wisdom in their eyes, and their lack of fear became a silent testament to a truth that lay beyond the old, simple fears. They were living proof that the heart of the blizzard was not entirely frozen, that within the deepest cold there could exist a spark of compassion. The echo of the Yuki Onna's choice in their home reverberated through the village, softening its edges, deepening its understanding of the world it inhabited. The spirit had not just freed a single family from a vow. She had, in her own indirect way, begun to free an entire community from the prison of its own fear. The legacy of frost and longing was being quietly rewritten, one thawed heart, one questioning child, one peaceful glance at the mountain at a time. The forging of a guardian. Haru's childhood, once defined by a forbidden boundary, now unfolded under the vast, open sky of a new understanding. The mountain was no longer a place of dread, but a library of mysteries, a temple of silent, powerful forces. As he grew into his teenage years, his father's trade of woodcutting felt increasingly restrictive. The bite of the axe into a tree's heart, the fall of a great cedar, it began to feel like a violation, a noisy intrusion into a world he had come to respect on a profound level. He found his calling not in the felling of trees, but in the quiet observation of the creatures that lived among them. He learned to move through the forest with a silence that rivaled the snowfall, his steps careful, his breathing controlled. He could sit for hours, perfectly still, watching a family of foxes at their play, or tracing the flight of a hawk. He learned the language of the birds and the signs of the weather in the shifting patterns of the clouds. The village began to know him not as Rai the woodcutter's son, but as Haru the watcher, the boy with the mountain in his eyes. Rai, seeing his son's passion, did not force the family trade upon him. He understood. Haru had a different relationship with the wilderness, one born from a connection he himself could never fully share. Instead, he taught Haru the practical skills of survival, how to set a snare that would catch without maiming, how to find the cleanest water, how to build a shelter from the wind. These lessons were no longer tinged with fearful warnings, but were given as tools for respectful coexistence. One afternoon, when Haru was 16, he ventured higher than usual, following the tracks of a rare silver-furred marten. The air grew thin and crisp, the familiar deciduous trees giving way to dark, solemn pines. He found himself in a landscape he knew only from his father's long-ago story, a place of jagged rocks and deep, shadowed ravines, not far from the cave that had once been a tomb and a birthplace for a secret. It was here he found the wounded kitsune. The beautiful fox, its coat the color of autumn leaves tipped with white, was trapped. Its hind leg was caught in the cruel iron teeth of a poacher's trap, the kind set not for food but for pelts. The animal was exhausted, its eyes rolling in terror and pain, its struggles having only tightened the metal jaws around its bone. Haru's heart clenched. He approached slowly, speaking in a low, soothing murmur. "Easy, little one, easy. I am not here to harm you." The kitsune snapped at him, a desperate, fearful gesture. Haru did not flinch. He could feel the animal's agony, its panic, a sharp, hot energy in the cool air. He knew he had to act quickly. The leg was badly broken. Freeing it was only the first step. The fox would never survive in this state. Alayhi salam, he worked to pry open the rusted jaws of the trap, using a stout branch for leverage. He felt a familiar, subtle drop in temperature. The chattering of a nearby squirrel ceased. The wind died down to an expectant hush. He was not alone. He did not need to look up. He could feel her presence, a crystallization of the air itself, a stillness that was both comforting and awe-inspiring. "It is in pain," her voice came, not from a single direction, but from the cold air surrounding him. It was the same voice that had once commanded his father's silence, but the edge of deadly frost was absent, replaced by a tone of observation. "I know," Haru replied, his focus on the trap. With a final, grating creak, the metal jaws sprang open. The kitsune tried to scramble away, but collapsed with a sharp yelp, its leg useless. Haru looked up then. She stood a few paces away, her form shimmering in the dappled light filtering through the pines. She was as beautiful and terrible as the first time he had seen her, but the terror was gone. In its place was a deep, resonant curiosity. "It will die," she stated, her pale eyes on the trembling fox. "The cold will take it tonight, or a wolf will find it. Its suffering will only be prolonged." "No," Haru said, his voice firm. He tore a strip of cloth from his own tunic. "It doesn't have to." He began to carefully, expertly splint the broken leg with 2 straight sticks and the cloth, his movements sure and gentle. He had done this before, for village dogs, for a lamb with a twisted foot. The Yuki Onna watched, her head tilted. This was a new kind of action to her. She understood the finality of the freeze, the clean cut of death. This struggle to preserve a broken life, this messy, determined effort, was alien. It was the opposite of her nature. "Why?" she asked, the question simple and profound. "Its spirit is ready to leave. You only delay the inevitable." Haru finished tying the splint and sat back, looking at her. "Because it wants to live," he said, his young face serious. "And because I can help. To do nothing when you can do something, that is its own kind of cold." The words hung in the air between them. That is its own kind of cold. They struck the Yuki Onna with a force that physical impact could never achieve. They described the essence of her existence for centuries. A chosen, enforced coldness. A refusal to intervene in the natural, suffering-filled course of life. She had been the end of stories, never the middle, never the struggle for continuation. Haru then did something that would have been unthinkable to any other mortal. He carefully gathered the wounded kitsune into his arms, ignoring the faint, warning growls. He stood and walked towards her. "Will you help me?" he asked, his gaze steady. "The way down is steep. If I fall, we both perish. You can make the path still." He was not asking for a miracle. He was not asking her to heal the fox. He was asking her for her partnership. He was acknowledging her power and asking her to use it, not for an end, but for a journey. He was inviting her into the messy, uncertain, hopeful process of preservation. The Yuki Onna was silent for a long moment, the forest holding its breath with her. The ghost of Tsuyu, the woman who had loved and nurtured, stirred with a powerful, forgotten yearning. This boy, this child of spring who understood the cold, was offering her a role she had not played in lifetimes. She gave a single, slow nod. Salam Haru began his careful descent. The mountain itself seemed to aid him. The loose scree on the path hardened under a thin, clear layer of ice, giving him secure footing. A gust of wind that would have pushed him off balance was diverted, parting around him like water around a stone. A treacherous patch of black ice was covered by a sudden, gentle fall of powdery snow, providing traction. She did not walk with him. She was the mountain's cooperation. She was the stability under his feet, the calm in the air around him. She was using her power as a guide and a guardian, a silent, invisible companion on a mission of mercy. When Haru finally reached the safety of the lower slopes, the kitsune, sedated by its own exhaustion and the strange, peaceful cold that enveloped it, he turned and looked back up the mountain. He could not see her, but he felt her gaze. "Thank you," he whispered into the cold, still air. There was no response, but a single, perfect snowflake, larger and more intricate than any he had ever seen, drifted down and landed on the forehead of the sleeping fox, melting slowly against its warm fur, a blessing and a seal. Haru carried the fox home. He and his mother nursed it back to health in a quiet corner of their shed. Weeks later, when the splint came off and the kitsune, with a last unreadable look from its intelligent eyes, limped back into the forest, Haru knew a chapter of his life had closed and a new one had begun. He was no longer just a watcher. He was a guardian. And he was not alone in his vigil. The spirit of the snow, the once feared Yuki Onna, had become his silent, powerful ally. The bridge between their worlds was no longer just a filament of connection. It was a path they had now walked together. The boy who understood the cold and the cold that had learned from the boy had forged a bond that would forever change the balance between the village and the mountain. The solstice and the shared vigil. The years continued their stately procession. Haru grew into a young man of 20, his quiet competence and deep knowledge of the mountain making him a respected, if somewhat solitary, figure in the village. He was a tracker without equal, a finder of lost things and lost people. Whispers followed him, tales of how he could walk through the worst blizzards and emerge unscathed, how the animals of the forest seemed to trust him. The old, fearful name for the mountain spirit was rarely spoken in his presence. A new, unspoken reverence had taken its place. Ro and Hanako aged with a grace that comes from a life of hard work and deep contentment. The memory of their long ordeal had faded into a foundational story, a scar that had healed strong. They watched their son with a mixture of pride and quiet awe, understanding that his path was intertwined with forces they could perceive but never fully grasp. The winter solstice arrived, the shortest day and the longest night of the year. In the village, it was a time of introspection, of huddling around hearths, of telling stories that reminded them of the sun's promised return. It was a night when the barrier between the world of the living and the spirit world was said to be at its thinnest. On this night, Haru felt a pull he could not ignore. He told his parents he was going to check the higher trap lines, a plausible excuse, but they knew the truth. He was answering a call they could not hear. They watched him go with calm hearts, trusting in the strange, sacred understanding that existed between their son and the mountain. Haru climbed high, past the old cedar, into the realm of rock and wind and eternal snow. The air was so cold, it was like breathing glass. The moon, full and brilliant, cast a blue-white light over the landscape, painting everything in stark, dramatic contrasts of silver and shadow. The world was utterly silent, a cathedral of ice. He reached a high plateau, a place that offered a breathtaking vista of the entire sleeping valley below, the village lights like a scattering of fallen stars. And there, waiting for him, was she. She was more substantial under the solstice moon, her form drawing luminescence from the celestial body. She did not speak as he approached, merely acknowledging his presence with a slight turn of her head. They stood together in silence, two guardians looking down upon the world they, in their own ways, watched over. It was she who broke the quiet, her voice the soft crunch of snow under a gentle weight. They celebrate the return of the sun down there. They light fires to encourage its journey. They are afraid of the dark, Haru said, his breath pluming in the air. They fear the cold will never end. It always ends, she replied, her gaze on the distant, warm pinpricks of light. And it always returns. It is the way of things. My time is the time of stillness, of sleep, of waiting. Theirs is the time of growth and noise. The two must dance together. This was a new wisdom, a perspective born from her centuries of observation and her recent personal reevaluation. She was no longer defining herself in opposition to the warmth, but a necessary part of a greater cycle. The kitsune, Haru said after a moment, it survived. It has a mate now. I see their tracks near the northern ridge. A silence fell again, but it was a comfortable, shared silence. Her presence, which had once been a source of paralyzing terror for his family, was now a calm, powerful companionship. They were two different expressions of the same mountain, one of life that respected the cold, one of cold that had learned to cherish life. I have watched many solstices, she said, her tone distant, contemplative. I have seen empires rise and fall in the lowlands. I have seen forests grow where glaciers once lay. I have seen generations of your village live and die. For so long, it was like watching patterns in the snow, beautiful but meaningless, a repetition without progression. She turned her pale eyes towards him. You and your family, you were a crack in the repetition, a story that changed. You showed me that an ending is not the only significant moment. The struggle to continue, the choice to preserve, that has meaning too. Haru listened, understanding that he was hearing a confession centuries in the making. He was in the presence of a spirit who was, in her own way, growing. "You are not what the stories say," he said softly. "The stories are not wrong," she corrected him, her gaze returning to the valley. "They are merely incomplete. I have frozen travelers. I have been the end of journeys. That has meaning too. But it is not the whole of it. You have helped me remember the rest." On this, the longest night, with the world holding its breath waiting for the sun, the Yuki, Onna, and the mortal guardian kept their shared vigil. They were a living bridge between the world of ice and the world of fire, between the spirit and the human, between the endless winter of the peak and the hopeful warmth of the valley. Elias Salam, the first faint hint of gray, touched the eastern horizon, heralding the slow return of the sun. The Yuki Anna's form began to soften, blending with the pre-dawn mist. "The dance continues," she whispered, her voice becoming part of the wind. Haru stood alone on the plateau as the sun finally breached the horizon, painting the peaks in fiery gold. The cold was retreating, and her presence with it. But he did not feel her absence. She felt her promise. She was the stillness, the sleep, the waiting. And he was the growth, the action, the preservation. They were partners in the great turning wheel of the seasons. He descended the mountain as the new day dawned, the memory of their shared vigil a warm ember in his heart. The legend of the Yuki Onna was now for him a living, breathing relationship. She was the solitude of the mountain, and he was its connection to the village. Their story was no longer one of fear and secrecy, but of a quiet, mutual respect that spanned the boundary between life and death, between warmth and cold, between a single mortal lifetime and an eternal glacial existence. The legacy was no longer just about a spirit of snow and ice. It was about the understanding that could bloom like a single, perfect snowdrop in the heart of the deepest winter. The fading and the firmament. Time, the one force that holds sway over both mortal and spirit, continued its inexorable flow. For Haru, its passage was marked in the deepening lines on his father's face, the gradual silvering of his mother's hair, and the steady, reliable turning of the seasons. He took a wife, a quiet, strong-willed woman named Akari, whose laughter was like the sound of a clear stream. They built a home not far from his parents, and in time, their own hearth was warmed by the cries of two children, a boy named Takeshi and a girl named Suki. The cycle of life, which the Yuki Onna had observed from a cold distance for centuries, was now a vibrant, personal reality for Haru. For the Yuki Onna, time was a different river. It was the slow creep of a glacier, the patient accumulation of millennia. Yet, even in her eternal existence, change was occurring. The profound shift initiated by her encounter with Ryo and deepened by her bond with Haru had altered the very fabric of her being. The core of frozen grief, once the absolute center of her power, was now encased in layers of new experience, curiosity, compassion, a fragile sense of connection. This internal thaw manifested in the world around her. The pockets of unnatural, lingering cold that had once defined her territory began to recede. The blizzards she conjured, while still formidable, lacked the vengeful, personal malice of before. They were expressions of weather, not extensions of a tormented soul. The mountain itself seemed to breathe easier. Life crept slowly higher. Hardy alpine flowers bloomed in places that had known only ice for 100 years. It was a gentle, almost imperceptible retreat, a softening of her dominion. She found she no longer needed to manifest in her full, terrifying glory. Her consciousness became more diffuse, woven into the gentle fall of snow, the morning frost on the spiderwebs, the cool shadow under a pine tree. She was becoming less of a singular, monstrous entity and more a gentle, pervasive spirit of the winter season, a return to a purer, less personal form. Her interactions with Haru became less about direct encounters and more about shared awareness. When he climbed the mountain, she was the sure footing on a slippery path. She was the sudden clarity in the air that revealed a hidden animal track. She was the gentle nudge of wind that steered him away from a hidden crevice. Their communication was silent, a language of intuition and the natural world. One autumn day, when the leaves were a blaze of fire and the air held the sharp tang of coming cold, Haru found his father sitting on a bench outside their old home, looking towards Mount Tsurugi. Ro was an old man now, his body frail, but his eyes still held their keen light. "She is quieter these days," Ro said, not turning as Haru approached. It was a statement that needed no context. Haru sat beside him, following his gaze. "The mountain is at peace." "Is she?" Ro asked, his voice thoughtful. "Or is she fading?" The question hung in the air, profound and unsettling. Haru had felt it too, a gentle withdrawal, a lessening of the intense, focused presence that had once defined the high peaks. It was not a weakening, but a transformation. The fierce, localized cold of a grieving heart was dissipating, spreading itself thin across the entire winter, becoming a part of the background rather than the main event. "I think," Haru said slowly, choosing his words with care, "she is remembering how to be a part of the world instead of apart from it. The sorrow that made her specific is healing." Ro nodded, a slow, understanding gesture. "A lifetime of silence, and in the end, I feel I understand her more than I ever did. She was never our monster, Haru. She was just lost, and we were a light that helped her find her way." It was the most profound thing his father had ever said about the spirit who had defined half his life. Haru placed a hand on his father's thin shoulder, a gesture of comfort and agreement. High above, the Yuki Onna felt the echo of their conversation. The threads connecting her to the family were faint now, thinned by time and the natural conclusion of their intense drama. Ro's thread was a fragile, guttering flame, burning low. Hanako's was a steady, warm ember. Haru's was a strong, bright cord, now intertwined with the vibrant, new threads of his own children. She felt no sadness at this fading. It was the way of things. Her purpose with them was complete. She had been their lesson in fear, their test of silence, and finally, their teacher in compassion and understanding. They, in turn, had been her bridge back from the abyss of absolute isolation. She turned her attention inward, to the ghost of Tsuyu. The frantic, pained energy was gone. In its place was a quiet acceptance, a memory that was no longer a bleeding wound, but a cherished, if sorrowful keepsake. The love for Kaito was still there, but it was no longer a scream frozen in ice. It was a gentle hum, a part of the mountain's eternal song. On a night of breathtaking clarity, when the winter stars were sharp, diamond points in a velvet sky, she gathered the last of her specific consciousness. She did not go to the village. She did not seek a final audience with Haru. That part of the story was written. Instead, she ascended to the very summit of Mount Tsurugi, a place where the air was too thin for mortals and the cold was absolute. She stood under the vast, star-dusted firmament, the entire world spread out below her like a sleeping creature. She could feel the slow, planetary turn, the dance of the seasons across continents, the immense, silent music of the cosmos. Her form began to unravel. It was not a death, not an end. It was a release. The concentrated essence of the Yuki-Onna, the beautiful, deadly, lonely spirit, dissipated. The sorrow, the love, the memory of Tsuyu, the centuries of observation, the recent years of connection, it all rose into the thin, cold air. She became the aurora that danced that night over the peak, a shimmering curtain of pale green and silver light, a silent, magnificent farewell. She became the particular crispness of the air that made the stars seem so close one could touch them. She became the profound, peaceful silence that exists at the top of the world. Down in the village, Haru stood outside his home, his wife Akari beside him, their children asleep inside. He watched the aurora dance over the mountain, its light reflected in his eyes. He felt no pull, no specific communication, only a vast, serene sense of completion. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that she was gone. Not dead, just returned. He took his wife's hand. "She's at peace," he whispered. Akari, who knew the whole story, squeezed his hand. "The mountain will miss her." "No," Haru said, looking at the silent, majestic peak silhouetted against the shimmering lights. "The mountain is her. She hasn't left. She's just remembered how to be everything instead of one thing." The legacy of the Yuki-Onna, the specific legend, was over. But her essence remained. She was in the first snowflake of winter, in the frost on the window pane, in the clean, sharp scent of the cold. She was in the stillness, the waiting, the sleep. The story of the beautiful, deadly spirit would still be told. But for those who knew, like Haru and his family, it was a story with a different ending. It was the story of a cold that learned to cradle a flame, a spirit who learned to love again from a distance, a winter that finally, gracefully, made peace with the coming spring. The legacy in the soil. Generations are the leaves on the great tree of a family, each one unique, yet drawing sustenance from the same deep roots. Haru lived a long, full life, becoming a grandfather himself, a revered elder whose stories were sought not for their fright, but for their wisdom. He never spoke openly of the Yuki-Onna to the wider village. That secret remained a sacred trust between him, his parents, and his own immediate family. But he wove the lessons she had taught them into the fabric of his being, and in doing so, passed them on. His son, Takeshi, possessed his grandfather Ryo's physical strength, but his father's quiet soul. He became a master carpenter, his hands shaping wood not with the destructive force of an axe, but with a creative, respectful precision. He saw the spirit in the grain of the cedar, the history in the nut of a pine. He understood that the mountain gave its trees a gift, not a right. His daughter, Suki, had Hanako's perceptive eyes and a voice that could soothe any crying babe. She became the village's most skilled herbalist, her knowledge of plants surpassing even Haru's. She knew which roots to harvest and which to leave, understanding that the mountain's bounty was a cycle to be maintained, not a treasure to be plundered. The fear of the mountain that had once gripped the village was a distant memory, a tale for the very old. The relationship had matured into one of deep mutual respect. The offerings at the tree line evolved. Now, alongside the traditional rice and salt, children would sometimes leave small, carefully whittled toys or bundles of sweet herbs, gifts for the spirit of the winter who was no longer feared but honored. The legend of the Yuki-Onna persisted, of course. Travelers would hear the tale in the inns, the story of the beautiful woman of snow who lured men to their frozen doom. But in Haru's village, the story had a coda, a whispered edition shared from parent to child. It was said that if your heart was pure and your intentions true, the spirit of the mountain could also be a guide, a protector. They spoke of a calming presence in a storm, an unseen hand that steadied a slipping foot on a high pass. The Yuki-Onna had become a complex symbol, a reminder of nature's deadly power, but also of its capacity for mercy. When Haru was a very old man, he asked his grandchildren to take him one last time to the foothills, to the place where the old cedar, now gnarled and immense, stood its silent vigil. He sat with his back against its rough bark, looking up at the peak of Mount Tsurugi, which was gleaming in the afternoon sun. He felt no pull, no specific presence. The intense, personal connection had faded with her transformation decades before. But the mountain was alive to him in a way it could never be to others. He could feel the memory in the rocks, the echo in the wind. He could feel the legacy she had left, not in a ghost or a spirit, but in the very culture of the people who lived in her shadow. His youngest granddaughter, a girl of 6 with eyes like dark pools, sat beside him. "Grandfather, is the snow lady really gone?" Haru smiled, a network of wrinkles spreading from his eyes. He picked up a handful of soil from the base of the cedar. It was dark, rich, and cool. "What is this?" he asked her. "Dirt," she said, puzzled. "Is it?" he asked. "Look closer." She peered at it. She saw a crumbled, decaying leaf. She saw a tiny white speck of a crushed seashell, a reminder that this entire valley was once under an ancient ocean. She saw a fleck of mica that glittered in the light. "This soil," Haru said softly, "holds the rain that fell 100 years ago. It holds the leaves from trees that grew when my grandfather was a boy. It holds the memory of everything that has ever lived and died here. The Snow Lady, her story is in this soil now. Her sadness, her loneliness, and her kindness. When you walk on the mountain, you are walking with her story. When the snow falls, that is her memory, covering the world in quiet. She is not gone. She is just part of everything." The little girl considered this, her small face serious. She looked from the soil in her grandfather's hand to the great, silent mountain, and back again. A new understanding, gentle and deep, dawned in her eyes. Haru knew then that the legacy was secure. It would not be carried forward as a terrifying secret or a dramatic legend, but as a simple, profound truth woven into the daily lives of his people. It was in the respect with which they harvested the forest, the kindness they showed to strangers, the understanding that the world was alive with stories more complex than any simple tale of good and evil. He closed his eyes, the sun warm on his face, the solid bulk of the mountain at his back. The journey that had begun with his father's terror in a cave was ending here, in peace, under the same sky. The intricate story of the Yuki-Onna was over, but its echoes would ripple through time, us endless and us quiet as the falling snow. The frost and the longing had finally found their rest, not in an ending, but in a beautiful, everlasting beginning. The Whisper in the Stone. A century flowed over the village like a slow-moving river, smoothing the sharp edges of recent memory into the rounded stones of legend. The name Rio was now an entry in the lineage scrolls, a founder remembered for his strength. Haru was a fond, almost mythical figure, the wise watcher who had understood the mountain's secret heart. The house where the great drama had unfolded had been expanded, rebuilt, and now sheltered Haru's great-grandchildren. The specific, chilling fear of the Yuki-Onna had been replaced by a general, cultural reverence for the spirits of the mountain, the kami of rock and stream and snow. The village itself had prospered. The careful, sustainable practices instilled by Haru and his children had borne fruit. The forests were thick and healthy, the game was plentiful, and the community had grown, its houses spreading a little further up on the safe lower slopes. They were a people in harmony with their world, their respect for it a daily prayer. It was into this world that a girl named Onna was born. She was the great-great-granddaughter of Haru, a child with eyes the color of dark amber, and a spirit that was both curious and deeply still. From the time she could walk, she was drawn to the quiet places, the mossy hollows behind the waterfall, the still, dark pools in the forest, the silent, sun-dappled glades. While other children played noisy games, Onna would often be found simply listening, her head tilted as if trying to decipher a conversation just beyond the range of human hearing. She felt the mountain not as a place, but as a presence. It was a feeling in the soil beneath her bare feet, a taste in the air, a certain quality of light through the leaves. She knew its moods. She could sense a coming storm not from the clouds, but from a subtle tension in the pine needles. She could find the first spring mushrooms not by sight, but by a faint, sweet hum in the earth. Her parents, who carried the family's unspoken history in their blood, understood. They, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, Haru's soul looking out from Hana's eyes. They did not try to curb her strangeness. They nurtured it. They told her the old stories, not just the common folk tales, but the family's own whispered narratives, of a great-grandfather who had spoken with the mountain, of a secret kindness hidden within the winter's heart. One afternoon, when Onna was 12, she was exploring a high meadow, a place dotted with wildflowers and crisscrossed with animal trails. She was following the delicate, almost invisible path of a line of ants, marveling at their purpose, when she stubbed her toe on a stone half buried in the turf. It was not a remarkable stone. It was gray, flecked with mica, about the size of her fist. But as she reached down to pick it up, a shiver passed through her, a sensation not of cold, but of profound age and poignant memory. It was smoother than it should have been, worn not by water, but by time and something else, a persistent, gentle touch. She held it in her palm, and a vision, clear and sharp as broken ice, flashed behind her eyes. She saw, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, a woman, beautiful and sad, sitting on a rock in this very meadow, though the trees were younger and smaller. The woman was not the terrifying specter of the legends. She was still and contemplative, her white kimono pooling around her like spilt milk. In her hand she held this same stone, her long, pale fingers tracing its surface over and over, a rhythmic, soothing motion. The feeling emanating from the vision was not malice, but a loneliness so vast and deep it made Hana's heart ache. It was the loneliness of the moon, of the empty sky between the stars. The vision vanished as quickly as it came. Onna was left standing in the sunny meadow, the stone cool and heavy in her hand. She knew, with the unshakable certainty of a child who has seen truth, that she had just touched a memory that did not belong to her. She had felt the echo of the Yuki Onna. She did not run. She did not scream. She sat down on the grass, cradling the stone. She closed her eyes and tried to listen. The wind rustled the leaves. A bee buzzed nearby. But beneath it all, she heard it. A whisper. It was not a sound for the ears, but for the spirit. It was the whisper of solitude, the soft, endless sigh of centuries passing, the memory of a love so strong it had frozen into a legend. Onna began to visit the meadow regularly, always bringing the stone with her. She would sit in silence, holding it, and open her mind. The visions did not always come, but the feeling did. She began to piece together a story not of a monster, but of a guardian. She felt the protective vigilance that had watched over her great-great-grandfather Haru. She felt the sorrowful love for a man named Kaito, a love that had become the bedrock of the mountain's winter. She felt the moment of release, when the specific, pained spirit had chosen to dissolve back into the whole. She was not communicating with a conscious entity. The Yuki Onna, as a singular being, was gone. What Hana was tapping into was the psychic residue left on the mountain, the emotional fossil record of a profound existence. The stone was a focal point, a repository of a particular moment of quiet sorrow. She tried to explain it to her mother once. "The mountain remembers her," Hana said, her voice soft. "It's like when you walk into a room where someone has been very sad or very happy and you can still feel it. The mountain feels like that. It remembers her sadness and her care." Her mother had listened, her eyes thoughtful. She did not dismiss it as a child's fancy. In a family that had housed a secret for generations, they understood that some truths were felt, not seen. Hana became the latest curator of the legacy. She did not speak of it to the other village children. It was too intimate, too fragile. But her connection to the natural world deepened. She could sense when a blizzard was coming, not just as a weather event, but as a shift in the mountain's emotional tenor, a gathering of the old, quiet sorrow. She could find the best healing herbs by feeling for the places where the mountain's energy was most vibrant and nurturing. The whisper in the stone was her inheritance. It was the final fading echo of the Yuki Onna story, passed down not through words, but through blood and soil and soul. In Hana, the spirit of the snow had found its final, gentle resting place. Not in fear, not in legend, but in the quiet, empathetic heart of a child who knew how to listen to the memories held in the world. The frost was gone, but the longing had been understood. And in that understanding, it had finally, truly found its peace. The cycle unbroken. The tapestry of life in the village continued to be woven, thread by colorful thread. Hana grew into a young woman, her connection to the mountain becoming an integrated part of her being, as natural as breathing. She became the village's unofficial seer, not by claiming any title, but by the uncanny accuracy of her intuitions. She would advise farmers on the best days to plant based on the feeling of the soil, guide hunters to areas where game was plentiful but not overhunted, and comfort the sick with a calm presence that seemed to soothe the very air around them. She married a kind-hearted potter named Kenji, whose hands shaped clay from the riverbanks into vessels of simple, profound beauty. He understood his wife's unique relationship with the world and built their home with a garden that blended seamlessly into the forest's edge, a place where the boundary between the domestic and the wild was intentionally blurred. In time, Hana gave birth to a son. They named him Kaito. It was not a conscious decision to echo the ancient, tragic name from the legend. The name had simply felt right to Hana, a sound that resonated with a deep, harmonic truth in her soul. When she held her newborn son for the first time, looking into his unfocused eyes, she did not feel the weight of history, but its gentle, cyclical promise. It was not a repetition, but a renewal. The boy, Kaito, grew under the benevolent gaze of the mountain. He was a child of sun and soil, with his father's creative hands and his mother's quiet perception. The story of the Yuki Onna was for him a fireside tale, a part of the village's rich folklore, but it held no personal terror. For him, the mountain was a playground, a teacher, a friend. When Kaito was 7, a hard winter fell upon the village. It was not a vengeful winter, but a deep, serious one, the kind that tested the community's reserves and its spirit. The snow piled high, and the cold was relentless. One evening, a blizzard swept down from the peaks, howling around the houses with a ferocity that reminded the elders of stories from long ago. During the height of the storm, Kaito, fascinated by the swirling white world outside, pressed his face against the cold window pane of his home. His breath fogged the glass. He drew a little picture in the condensation, a stick-figure man and a smiling sun. His mother, Hana, watched him from across the room, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She felt the storm's energy, the familiar, ancient sorrow that was the mountain's winter memory. But she also felt something else, something new, layered over the old, a sense of watchful, gentle protection. Kaito, finishing his drawing, leaned back. The fog on the glass began to recede from the heat of the room, but around his simple drawing, something miraculous happened. The moisture did not vanish. Instead, it crystallized. A delicate, perfect frame of frost ferns formed around his childish sketch, preserving it, highlighting it, turning it into a work of ephemeral art. The sun had a halo of ice crystals. The stick figure seemed to be standing in a forest of frozen lace. The boy gasped in delight. "Look, Mama! The frost is making my picture pretty!" Hana came to stand beside him, her heart swelling with a joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She looked at the beautiful, icy frame, a testament to a power that could now only express itself in the most gentle, supportive of ways. It was a blessing, a welcome. She put her arm around her son. "The mountain likes your drawing, Kaito. It is helping you make it special." He beamed, his young face full of wonder, completely unafraid. In that moment, the cycle was complete. The spirit born from the loss of a man named Kaito was now, centuries later, gently blessing a child who carried the same name. The deadly breath that had once frozen souls was now a creative force, framing a child's art with beauty. The loneliness that had haunted the peaks was now a supportive presence, a silent partner in the simple joy of a family's life. The legacy of the Yuki Onna had come full circle. It had begun with a love lost to the snow, and it ended with a love nurtured by it. The story was no longer one of frost and longing, but of frost and belonging. The spirit was gone, but her essence had been woven back into the world, not as a curse, but as a gentle, enduring part of the balance. The blizzard raged on outside, but inside the warm house, a child laughed, and a mother knew that every snowflake that fell was a promise kept, a memory honored, a silent, beautiful note in the eternal, peaceful song of the mountain. The journey was over. The adventure was done. All that remained was the quiet, everlasting peace of a story that had finally and perfectly reached its end. The silence of the summit. The village, cradled in the arms of the mountain, slept under a blanket of stars so clear and cold they seemed to burn with a silent blue fire. The great storm had passed, leaving in its wake a world scoured clean and plunged into a deep, crystalline quiet. Inside the house where young Kaito slept, the warmth of the hearth had dwindled to embers, and the magical frost frame around his window drawing had long since melted away, leaving only the memory of its beauty. High above, on the summit of Mount Tsurugi, the silence was absolute. It was a different quality of silence from that of the sleeping valley. This was the primeval quiet that existed before the first bird sang, before the first wind stirred. It was the silence of stone and ice and vacuum. The aurora that had once danced as a spirit's farewell was absent tonight. The sky was a black velvet cloth pinned with diamond-sharp stars. An old man, older than any in the village could remember, stood on that summit. He was not truly a man, not anymore. He was a memory given form, a thought sustained by the will of the mountain itself. He was the last fading echo of the woodcutter Ryo, not as he was in life, but as the mountain remembered him, a figure of endurance, of a promise kept through unimaginable strain. He had been drawn here, to this place of endings and beginnings, by a sense of completion. The cycle he had inadvertently set in motion was now finished. The love he had for his family, the fear he had carried, the secret that had shaped his life, it had all been transmuted through the alchemy of generations into something pure and enduring. It was no longer his story. It belonged to the soil, to the air, to the children who drew pictures on frost-laced windows. He looked down at the village, a mere smudge of darkness in the moonlit valley. He could feel the warm, sleeping pulse of his many times great-grandchildren. He could feel the steady, creative hum of Kenji the potter's soul. He could feel the deep, resonant connection in Hana, a mirror of the understanding his own son Haru had possessed. And he could feel the absence. It was not a hollow or a sad absence. It was a peaceful one, like a finally healed wound. The specific, intense consciousness of the Yuki Onna was gone, her energy seamlessly reabsorbed into the mountain's vast spirit. The threads that had once connected them, of fear, of obligation, of a strange, strained kinship, had all dissolved. There was nothing left to bind him. A wind, thin and sharp as a razor, blew across the peak. It did not touch him. He was beyond such things now. He was a ghost not of a person, but of a fulfilled purpose. He turned his gaze inward, to the core of the mountain. He could feel its immense, slow thoughts, the pressure of continents shifting far below, the patient flow of water through deep aquifers, the ancient memory of fire that had once built these very peaks. And woven through it all, like a single silver thread in a colossal tapestry, was the story, their story. A story of a snow spirit and a woodcutter, of a vow and its release, of fear transformed into reverence. It was a small story in the grand scheme of the mountain's life, a fleeting moment, but it had left its mark. It had changed the mountain's relationship with the tiny beings who lived on its flanks. It had added a note of compassion to the symphony of the seasons. The old man's form began to grow transparent, allowing the starlight to pass through him. There was no pain, no regret, only a profound and final sense of peace. His journey, which had begun with a desperate fight for life in a storm-lashed cave, was ending here, in the absolute stillness of the summit. He was not returning to the mountain. He was realizing that he had never left it. His love for his family, his struggle, his silence, it was all a part of the mountain's own story, just as the Yuki Onna's sorrow had been. They had been two instruments playing a brief, dissonant, and ultimately beautiful duet in the mountain's eternal song. Alafak flashed the last of his form dissipated into the starlight, becoming one with the silence. A single, coherent thought echoed into the void, a final signature on the completed tale. It is enough. The summit was empty once more. The silence remained, but it was no longer the silence of solitude. It was the silence of a story that has been fully told, a song that has reached its final, perfect note. Below, the world waited for the dawn, unaware that the last ghost of its most intimate legend had just found its rest, leaving behind only the enduring, gentle peace of a promise kept across centuries.